Now is the time to cross over from ashes to beauty. We have been forged in the fire of adversity, called to return to our first love. Follow the ancient paths as we discover the hidden word of Yahuwah. This is Crossing Over with Jessica Arellanes.
Good evening and welcome to Crossing Over, the Sunday edition. Hey, listen, I know this is not our usual time and date, but we have a special guest for you. It's going to be an amazing show. Man, I'm excited. I'm so excited. And if we're a little behind, it's Dr. Pidgeon and Zen Garcia's fault. That's who's coming on tonight. And I will blame it on them. I'll tell you why. Because earlier I called to get some bio info and I said, hey, Dr. Pidgeon, what you going to talk about? And he says, well, I got this, and that, and this. I said, whoa, and forget it. It turned into this dialogue that was so dynamic, I couldn't get off the phone. I said, man, now I got to call Zen, right? And you know, Zen is explosive. And I'm like, whoa, two dynamic men. So I call Zen, what do you want to talk about? So he says, hey, we're going to talk about the Thracian Chronicles and the scripts decoded. I said, what? And he's giving me, and I'm sitting here taking notes like I usually do. And forget it, my time was consumed. So I know that if just that little tiny bit of information that was given to me threw me for a loop. I mean, it was so exciting to hear what these men had to say. Imagine what they're going to present tonight. So how exciting is it that we get to be a part of that? Let me bring our guests on. Let's see. We got Dr. Pidgeon in the house.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi, it's all your fault.
I know, this was such a, of course, I love sharing the show with Zen. It's always great. He and I have terrific discussions together. And so this, I think, is going to be very exciting. But I think also when I was doing the research for this particular show, I mean, I came upon some things, like I normally do, stumbling around in the dark. Hey, what's that? Oh, whoa, wait a minute. And what we're going to see tonight, I think, is going to answer a lot of questions. I mean, there's a lot of questions out there about what language was spoke and when, and what difference does it make?
Right.
What difference does it make?
Sure.
And we're going to see some things here because of the just kind of looking at the forest for the trees, right? Often when you're in the woods, right, all you can see is, that last branch that poked you in the eye. And you don't really see the fact that you're in an evergreen forest as compared to, say, a deciduous forest.
Sure.
So by looking at those kinds of things, at these macro principles, we're going to be able to discover some things about these extra texts that are going to reveal some history that's going to be just mind-boggling.
Yeah, someone in the chat room said, just breathe. Are you kidding? I've been trying to breathe ever since I knew that we were going to have Zen Garcia on. Zen, welcome to Crossing Over. It's your first time. However, we've been trying to get together for a while now. And Wednesday, we have a special show scheduled. It's our Christmas special, right, Zen? Good afternoon, or is it evening already where you're at?
Yeah, no, it's 8 o'clock, East Coast, United States of America, Athens, Georgia area, and always a great pleasure to be on with Dr. Pidgeon. I have high respect and great, just feel that he is one of the top-notch researchers in the world on all the things that he covers, especially with regard to biblical history and the ancient manuscripts. And so, yeah, we always come together and the Spirit leads, and it's always a blessing for, us and the audience. So, and it's great to be here with you as well, Jessica.
Thank you. Wow, what a pleasure that I get to host both of you. What a dynamic duo. So, before we get started, I want to introduce who you are to our audience. Zen Garcia, you are author, radio show host, and publisher. Your publishing company is called Sacred Word Publishing, and you actually not modified, but you reformatted and compiled the Aramaic and the Palestinian Targums, did you not?
Yes, did make them available only because they, so many people were interested, and I felt that it was an ancient resource which so many people needed to have access to and to begin to actually know what they were and to study, because I do believe that they will greatly benefit those that begin to read and examine them in thorough manner. And they were not available in the time that I was seeking them out and reading from them. And so I initially put them into book form to have them for my own benefit and to have them for my own study. And then others asked me to make them available. And then when we started Sacred Word Publishing, I decided to, extend that courtesy to everybody.
Awesome. Thank you for doing that. Dr. Pidgeon, you are also the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, along with the group there at Sefer Publishing, but you also have a publishing house, and you have included some of these extra biblical texts in the Eth Sefer. You want to talk about that for a second?
Sure. Yeah, the Et Sefer is a unique binding, if you will, that we came together and published 87 books in a collection, and it's a little bit abnormal in size, because what you find in the KJV AD or the 1560 Geneva is 81 books, and our text has 87 books. And part of the reason we did it is because, of course, we have the benefit that the KJV interpreters, the Geneva interpreters did not have, which is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are very kind of dispositive, if you will, because they demonstrate a selection of texts that were concluded upon back in the 2nd and 3rd century BC, when they began to put these scrolls away and to memorialize these scrolls to be placed in these vases up in the caverns there above Qumran. And as a result, like, for instance, we were at a conference once when the book was first starting, and it was a prophecy conference, and I would say 60% of the prophetic teachers were teaching on Enoch, on Hanok. And they were all disclaiming the book. It's not canonized, but yet they were all teaching on it. And of course, we had the doorbell was ringing and the phone was buzzing off the hook of people who wanted to read 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, and 3rd Enoch. Now, ultimately, we did a lot of research on Hanok, and we published a kind of a compilation edition, if you will, that used the D.H. Lawrence, the Knib, and the R.H. Charles versions of Hanok into a single collection. And even then, I think the D.H. Lawrence was the closest to the Ethiopic text, from which we have the so-called original. But at any rate, we ended up adding these books that were found significantly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a few other prophetic books like 2nd Baruch, and of course, 3 and 4 Maccabees. And we also added additions to Esther and 3rd Ezra and 4th Ezra. And those books turned out to be very significant. Now, there are some other books that I think are very powerful books in this same period. And Zen and I have talked about them before, too, like, for instance, the Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs, or the book of Joseph and Asenath. And of course, thanks to my friends Stephen and Yana Ben Noon, we have also discovered this book called The Ascents of James. Now, The Ascents of James was a text contained in the Clementine book Recognitions. And Recognitions is a very interesting compilation. It's really, it's a hodgepodge. It's a soup of writers that came together under the name Clement, some of whom were corrupt writers, some of whom, put some other things in place. But these few verses that are known as the Ascents of James have been the subject of intense research. And the Ascents of James may be the most credible 1st century document in existence today. And so as we looked at these extra scriptural books, and as we look at these, you're going to see tonight, and I think Zen is going to be able to really help us get through some of these things. We're going to see tonight that knowing about these books, just from kind of a macro view, to look at them and say, oh, what's going on here? What language are they in? When did they come about? What's their story? That's going to tell a huge tale. It's going to tell a huge tale. That alone, without even reading a word, that's going to tell a huge tale.
Yeah, you're putting a lot of the pieces together, and it's giving us a dynamic view. Zen, are you still there with us?
I am.
Yeah,
And yes, I'm
absolutely
very
stunning.
excited about all this as well.
Yeah, let's get started. So before we do, just an FYI, I have placed Zen Garcia's contact information in the dialog box located below. If you will, please consider hitting that like button so this video can generate. Make sure that you share this video, let other people know. I think this is a very important topic. Again, we're talking about a paradigm, a perspective, a view, and that some of these contexts, some of these books will help to add to your faith paradigm, right? So my first question before we get started, and I'm sure everybody wants to know, this is pertaining to both Zen and Dr. Pidgeon, is the world flat or round? No, I'm just kidding. No, don't answer that.
Let's flip a coin.
The earth, is it flat or is it round? No, I'm just kidding. I said, oh, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that to them. No, I'm just kidding. We'll do that another time. We were actually going to have this this dialogue. It wasn't a debate, but we were going to conduct a dialogue between both you and Zen and see, so have you both present your information regarding that topic, but we'll do that some other time. I thought that was funny. I'm sure everybody's going to be like, well, it's flat, it's round, it's flat.
Here comes Jessica making trouble again.
Yeah. All right, Zen. And as we get through the show, I will let people know about your conference. You got a conference coming up not too far from now in March 27th through 29th.
Yes.
Want to talk about that for a second?
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that up. And
For sure.
yeah, Dr. Pidgeon will be a guest speaker there at the conference, along with myself, my son, Justin James Garcia, Stephen and Yana Ben-Noon, Rob Skiva, Nathan Reynolds, Laurel Austin will also be speaking, Dr. Joy Jeffries Pugh. And so there's a number of really incredible speakers. Gary Wayne will also be there, and he is one that doesn't do a lot of conferences, and so and Dr. Joy as well. And so for those that are great fans and followers of their work, this will be a time to gather together with other really incredible speakers and to see their presentations and to meet them, share perhaps meal and dialogue. But also the Friday day before, we will be doing a day trip to the Georgia Guidestones, just to give people opportunity to see those monuments of the New World Order, the kind of 10 commandments of the New World Order, and to just speak about that as well, include that in their journey. And then I'm very excited that we are trying to and get set up that Dr. Pidgeon will be baptizing Monday after the conference, those that should be wanting and willing, and also in a flowing river. And so that should be a really beautiful experience as well. And you can find all this information out at sacredwordpublishing.com, and to get your tickets and access to the conference and to see the lineup and the topics that the speakers will be presenting on.
Absolutely. And again, for more information, you can go to sacredwordpublishing.com. I have it located on the banner just below. Lots of great content there on Zen Garcia's website. And if you want to get a hold of him personally, like I said, I left the contact information in the dialog box below in the information box. So let's get started with tonight's show. We're going to talk a little bit about the Targums. Dr. Pidgeon has, you've been doing some research regarding the Celtic or Chaldean people and have come to the conclusion that they may derive from the line of Reuben. I have your PowerPoint here if you would like me to bring it up, or if you want to introduce a topic while I do so.
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and let's bring up that first slide, and we'll begin with this. We're going to begin with this concept of the Targum, or the Targums, depending on how you want to look at it. But what we're going to see is what we're going to talk about tonight. And, and I have to hand it to you, Zen. I mean, I agree with you. Part of the reason we expanded the Sefer was for a similar reason. I was putting together the text that I was going to have for my own research, and I'd put it together in a green binder, and this was going to be my book, and that's what I was doing. And only it was many years later, more than 10 years later, that we finally got together and said other people wanted to read the additional books, and so we began publishing. But when we look at this situation here, ancient texts, extra scriptural reading for the extra special mind. We're going to show you there is some biblical truth here that we're going to find that is extremely important as part of this teaching. Now, and before we get into the Thracian Chronicles, which is going to be a very good discussion, I think. When we talk about the Targums, there is something that happened. In fact, Jessica, can you skip to, I think, maybe slide 3, maybe? No, let's go to,
Tell me when.
just a minute. Let's go to slide 4. Behold, right there. That's the one. Behold, one you just had.
Right before it? Okay.
Yeah, there, right there. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this for a minute. Now, this is a passage, one of these things that we discovered when we placed Fourth Ezra inside the text, and it's an extremely important passage, and it's a passage for all of those who are students of Scripture to read, because in this passage it reads, "Behold, Yahweh, I will go as you have commanded me, and reprove the people which are present. But they that shall be born afterward, who shall admonish them? Thus the world is set in darkness, and they that dwell therein are without light." Because why? Because your Torah is burnt. Therefore, no man knows the things that are done of you, or the work that that shall begin. In other words, by the time we get to Ezra, which of course is after the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, the Temple of Solomon was destroyed by, of course, the Babylonian army. Now, when you see this, the temple and all of the precious things were taken away. But here, Ezra is telling you categorically, the written record is burnt. The written record is burnt. And, I'm the one who holds this knowledge, and I will go as you've commanded me, and I'll reprove the people which are present. But what about those that are born after me? Who's going to admonish them? Thus the world is set in darkness, and they that dwell therein are without light. Okay, let's go to the next slide up. Now here we see, but if I have found grace before you, send the Ruach HaKodesh into me, and I shall write all that has been done in the world since the beginning, which were written in your Torah, that men may find your path, that they which will live in the latter days may live. And he answered me, saying, Go your way, gather the people together, and say unto them, they that seek you not for 40 days. Okay, next slide. And come hither, and I shall light a candle of understanding in your heart, which shall not be put out till the things be performed, which you shall begin to write. And when you have done, some things shall you publish, and some things shall you show secretly to the wise. Tomorrow, in this hour, shall you begin to write. Okay, and the next slide, I think it's an extremely important one. El Elyon gave understanding unto the 5 men, and they wrote the wonderful visions of the night that were told, which they knew not. And they sat 40 days, and they wrote in the day, and at night they ate bread. As for me, I spoke in the day, and I held not my tongue by night. And in 40 days they wrote 94 Sephrim. Okay, next slide. And it came to pass when the 40 days were filled that El Elyon spoke, saying, The first that you have written, publish openly, that the worthy and the unworthy may read it. But keep the 70 last, that you may deliver them only to such as be wise among the people. For in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. And I did so. So when we ask ourselves the question, why should we read extra scriptural texts? Because in them is the fountain of knowledge. In them is the spring of wisdom, the spring of understanding. Where'd it go?
I don't know.
The last slide. The last slide.
Which one?
Okay. The very bottom one. One more. Yeah. For in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. Right? The spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. In some of the books, like in your 66 book canon, you don't have the wisdom of Solomon. You don't have the wisdom of Sirach. You don't have these teachings of Baruch. You don't have the teachings of 3 and 4 Ezra. They're missing. They're gone. They're not in your 66 book Bible. And so, from my opinion, you're missing the spring of understanding, the fount of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. Okay, now let's go back, Jessica, to slide 2, if you will. Slide 2. And when you get back there, you'll see here. Now, this is another interesting passage. One more. Slide 3, I'm sorry. More up. Okay, here we go. Now, this comes from Nehemiah. So they read in the Sefer, in the Torah of Elohim distinctly, and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. Now, what was going on here, what was being said here by Nehemiah, is something that's setting the stage for the Targums, okay? Because what had happened is you had this destruction of the Temple of Solomon, and with it, the Ivrit, the Hebrew word, the Torah in the Ivrit language. It wasn't the first time that the Ivrit language had died, and it certainly wouldn't be the last time that it died. This is a language that's died. Some scholars believe it's died 7 times. And so here, now you have something, and now I want to go into this for just a little bit before we get into the Targums, because you have a very interesting story that's set out in Scripture, and it's one that's worthy of note, because Abraham, he had a brother. He had this brother Nahor, right? His father was Terach, and his father was an idol maker. But he had a brother named Nahor. And after Abraham left and he went into the land of promise, he left his brother Nahor behind. But Nahor was not an idle person. He had many sons by his wife, and then he had another 4 sons by his concubine. One of those sons was a son named Ma'achah, whom I believe is the father of the Ma'akabim, or the Maccabees, that they came from this tribe of Nahor under the name Ma'achah, the son of the concubine of Nahor. But Nahor, his house would become a very significant house. And when you look at the history, you say, well, what history? How do we know this history of this house of Nahor? Well, you can kind of see it in the Bible. If you look in Scripture, in the Tanakh, you can see it. If you look through there, you cipher through it and you rifle through it, you can find it. Because what happens is this, historically speaking, Abraham leaves the house, he leaves the land of Haran, in the land of Ur, and this place Haran. Now, Haran is a place in Turkey, and I've showed this to you guys before on Google Earth, that there's an actual square of land there, and this temple called Göbekli Tepe is just immediately north of that square up in the mountains there, which appeared to be some kind of temple of sacrifice for these people of Haran, or in the land of Ur. Now, these people that were in Haran, this house of Nahor, this house would get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and expand and expand and expand. And they became known as, in the Ivrit, they became known as the Kasdim. But you'll read them all day long in your English Bible, as the way it's pronounced in America anyway, as Chaldeans. But the correct pronunciation is not Chaldeans, rather, but Chaldeans, and it's really not Chaldeans, because in the Ivrit, it's Kasdim. However, these Kasdim swelled, became a large people, and then they would assimilate under this banner of Nineveh in the Assyrian Empire, claiming they were the sons of Ashur. Or now maybe they had joined with the sons of Ashur, but they were of the line of Arpachshad. But nonetheless, they joined with this house of Ashur. They become the Assyrian Empire, very dominant empire that would destroy the northern kingdom of Israel in around 722 BC and chase those people really out of the area. Then these people, one of their sons, Nebuchadnezzar, would take Nineveh, and then he would eventually build this city, Babel. And if you read in Scripture, it will tell you that Babylon was the excellence of the Kasdim, or the excellence of the Chaldeans. So Babylon, the city, even though we call it Babylon, and those were Babylonian people, they were really Kasdim. They were Chaldeans. They were the Kasdim. And so these Kasdim, they became very dominant in Babylon. Now, what was the language of the Kasdim? Well, the language of the Kasdim was Aramaic. It was Aramaic. Now, so what you see is the Sumerian record, the Sumerian manuscript in Sanskrit and so forth, would be replaced by this language, Aramaic. Aramaic would supersede the old Sumeric cuneiform. And so here comes Aramaic as the language of who? The Kasdim, the Chaldeans, the children of Nahor, the brother of Abraham. Right? Okay. Now, what happens is these, you have the house of Israel taken captive here in 586 BC, and they're taken into Babylon. And when they're taken into Babylon, when Ezra appears, he's teaching them the Torah. He's teaching them the Torah of Elohim, and he's interpreting it in Aramaic. He's telling them, well, this is what the Torah means. He would read it to them in Hebrew. It's like we do right now. We read it to you in English, right?
Right.
Oh, well, let's talk about what is meant in, the book of, Bereshith. We don't sit here and read it to you in Hebrew. I mean, you could get it in a synagogue. You could get it in Hebrew. But even if it was read in Hebrew, if you're in America, you're going to get the rabbi telling you what was said there in English. Right. He's going to tell you in English. Well, this is what happened with Ezra. He was teaching the Torah. He was teaching these words. He was teaching what was in the script, but he had to teach it in Aramaic. So this passage in Nehemiah is very clear. Well, it's not very clear, but where it says, so he read the Sefer in the Torah of Elohim distinctly. Now, what would be better said there is, so they read in the Sefer the Torah of Elohim, and interpreting it, it gave sense to what was being said, and he caused them to understand the reading because he was giving it to them in Aramaic.
Makes sense.
Right?
Wow.
Okay.
Now,
Right.
there was a key word that you used, and I want to ask this of both of you, Zen and Dr. Pidgeon, really quick. A key word, and you actually didn't use it, you were reading from it, and the key word was end times. So do you think that perhaps these documents, these texts were perhaps hidden from a particular generation so that it can be preserved for an end time? Could it be that this is that hidden manna preserved for the end times in order to help us endure? And, because I don't know if we could continue to endure on the manna that we've been given in the past. It had become a little stale, to say the least. But could it be that these texts were hidden on purpose, that Yahuwah allowed them to be veiled?
Zen?
I absolutely believe that this is part of the spirit of wisdom and truth and prophecy being poured out upon all flesh that Yahuwah had promised in Joel and in Acts. And yes, this is part of the unveiling of all things, the hidden things. And so, yeah, I absolutely believe without a doubt that, even the work of myself and Dr. Pidgeon and bringing to light this knowledge, as well as so many other texts, because so much is coming to light in this day and age and is easily accessible, that this is without a doubt the Most High bringing forth truth in all aspect.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
All right.
And just to finish answering that question, let's look at the first verse of the book of Hanok or Enoch that reads, this Enoch 1:1, the word of the blessing of Hanok, how he blessed the elect and the righteous who were to exist in the time of trouble,
right,
rejecting all the unrighteous and wicked. So this book, the book of Hanok, was not directed for people in the 1st century or even in the 15th century. It's directed for those people who would see the time of trouble, the time of Jacob's trouble.
Makes sense. Yeah. Very good. Very good. All right. So back to Nehemiah. You were concluding.
So in conclusion, when we talk about this, what we see is, and here's where it gets very interesting, and this is why the Targums are so critically important. Here you have Ezra saying, okay, I've got to make sense of all of this Hebrew stuff that we've lost. These people don't speak Hebrew anymore. I've got to make sense of it. And so in order to make sense of it, I've got to teach it to them in Aramaic. And so he starts teaching it to them in Aramaic. And then eventually his teaching would be written down in the Aramaic. Now, where this gets fascinating, this is what's so important about the Targums. And the Targums, and these are all, by the way, the Targums precede the Talmud. Even though there are, I think there are Talmudic corruptions of the Targum that appear later on, like the Yerushalmi Targum, for instance. You have this idea that somehow the rabbinical authority was going to grab a hold of this idea of the Aramaic explanation and then try to pull it in. but there are some significant Targums, the books that I think Zen has published, for instance,
Yeah.
which are explanatory, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just read an excerpt here from Zen, from your website at Sacred Publishing. And it says here, Targum, meaning translation, references the various language transliterations of the original Hebrew Torah, which were commissioned, created by temple elders. The Aramaic and Palestinian versions printed here are acknowledged to be the oldest and most widely used renderings of the ancient language translations of the original Hebrew Torah, though they are accepted to date back to at least the first century CE. You Zen believe them to be half a millennia older, as they first came into being to accommodate the Israelites' assimilation of Aramaic when exiled to Babylon in 597 BCE. It was during the 70 years of that diaspora that the Aramaic became the predominant colloquial language and accepted vernacular of use by the Hebraic peoples. During the 70 years of assimilation, the Israelites' use of Hebrew as lexicon dwindled from being the primary dialect of everyday conversation to being one of mostly scholastic application utilized intellectually by the priestly order or the class. Wow. That's pretty much kind of what Dr. Pidgeon was saying. What's your take on the Targums, Zen?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Along with what Dr. P was revealing, it's because everything was burned up. All the knowledge was lost. And Esdras and also Jeremiah, Baruch, and also Daniel, you'll see that portions of those texts were written in Aramaic as well. And they were the ones that were part of the exile of that time. And it shows the transition of the language that the Israelites used from Hebrew to Aramaic. And again, you like when you look up the Targum in Wikipedia or other sources, they, the so-called professionals want to date it to the first century CE. But again, in my opinion, it goes back to, as Dr. P is bringing forth, back to the diaspora, and it should be 587 BC when the temple was destroyed and Nebuchadnezzar took the people into exile for that 70-year diaspora. And it was during that time that they assimilated Aramaic as their dominant lexicon. And then when the temple was rebuilt and worship reinstituted, that was when, and Ezra, the work of Ezra, and bringing forth all of this hidden knowledge again and making it available to the Israelites themselves, that he provided that in the Aramaic as well. And Targum itself just means translation. It's an Aramaic word
Excellent.
that means translation.
Now, what does it consist of? You gave me a website here, and I'll share it in just a second, targums.info, I-N-F-O. And I see here the Pentateuchal Targumim, and then I see the Targum Obadiah and the Targumim of the Megillot. What is that? You want to explain that to our viewers?
Yeah, sure. Again, with Targum just means translation. And so
Right?
what you see, even the Greek Septuagint and the English King James, they are Targums. They're just translations of the Hebrew Torah into a different language. And so every translation is what the Aramaic word Targum is. And so as um as we see that the first two, that the Israelites themselves, when they rebuilt the temple and began to reinstitute worship, they kept having to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. And so it was then that the Targum came into existence and was made available for the Israelites themselves to study their own, holy texts. And then as we went later and later in throughout the time in history, that the different translations of the scriptures into different languages, these are all targums. As I said, the Greek Septuagint, I believe the Aramaic Targum being the oldest, that it came about sometime in 400 BC after the rebuilding of the temple, and then the Greek Septuagint, then the I believe it was 216 BC, and then thereafter you see all of the other different translations. But even the scriptures of the minor prophets and others, as you may mention there, Obadiah, Ruth, and Megaloth, and these others, uh, these are what were now translated into English and made available for modern study. But the Targums, as different components and people began to translate different portions of the holy text and to make them available in different languages, these just became available over time. But the oldest renditions are only of the five books of Moshe, because those are the only, holy texts that the Israelites used during that time. And
Makes
then
sense.
we have the additions of, Daniel and all the other prophets and the minor prophets over time and age. And, as people made these translations into different languages, these also became available uh, to different individuals and populations for their own study. And we see that Targums are being made even in this day and age because as the gospel is preached all to the ends of the world, these different um, populations that don't have the scriptures in their own language, these targums are being compiled and made available. And so,
Awesome. And
yeah,
just to clarify that question, so there are two major interpretations. One of them is the
and the
Targum
oldest,
Onkelos, yeah, and the Targum Jonathan. So
right?
for those who are not familiar with the Targums, I just wanted to make that clear. You have the Navim, which is the prophets, and then you have the Torah, which would be the written laws or the edicts of Yahuwah. So both you gentlemen, I don't know too much about the refutations, but is there any refute regarding the authenticity of the Targums, and what's some of the differences? Why is it necessary to even include the Targums in our studies? I mean, what's profound? What's profound in the Targums aside from it just simply supporting what we are already convinced of?
Doctor,
Well,
Who
yeah,
wants to
thanks,
take that
Dan.
one?
I would share this. I mean, I think this, that when you talk about the Torah, there is a Samaritan Pentateuch. And the Samaritan Pentateuch is worthy of reading, and particularly in, comparing it with the Masoretic Pentateuch. And so when people say, well, you can't add to or take away from the Torah, are we certain what is in the Torah?
Hmm.
And
right,
so we look at this kind of information, we say, well, the Torah said this or the Torah said that, particularly with specificity. Then we have to look at some of the other languages. We have to look at some of the other ancient texts. And the fact that we have an idea what the thing read or what it meant at that time compared to what somebody else who was living at that time wrote about it, meaning. And this is where the Targum becomes so important, because I think we do have evidence, Zen, when we look at that passage out of Nehemiah. I think that passage in Nehemiah does show that Ezra was in fact translating, was in fact, trying to bring the message of what was found in the Hebrew, in the ancient Hebrew, and he was doing so by teaching in the Aramaic, even as he began to scribe later, and to restore the Hebrew. And so I think you're right. I think you're dead right about its dating. You're somewhere between 400 and 500 BC. And the historians, most historians, when I was talking with Ross, in Wales, we were talking about archaeologists being absolutely the worst historians on earth. And I think L.A. Marzulli will agree with that. When you find some 22-mile long, burial mound that's in the shape of a serpent that you can't see unless you're flying in a helicopter, and the archaeologists are saying, yeah, these guys created this by using a three-pronged wooden branch and scraping it onto some piece of leather. I mean, it just begs the question what their minds are thinking when they come up with this stuff. But so I don't have a lot of faith in what a lot of the modern historians, particularly secularists, have to say about the dating on some of these manuscripts. But why is it so important to be able to look at these things? Because when you see a very subtle nuance in the Torah, and you might see a discrepancy in the Samaritan Pentateuch, then you're going to want to ask yourself the question: well, what does that mean? Now, let me give you one example, and I'm going to turn it back to Zen. Zen and I talked about this on a show on his channel a few months back. We were talking about the teraphim, and when you're reading a 66 book canon, you get the word teraphim. I don't know, it's a couple of times in the text, and you have no idea what it is. It could, for all you know, it could be a cherubim or a seraphim, but it really isn't. A teraphim gets specific definition in the Targum, and it also has a specific definition in the book of Jasher, which, by the way, interestingly enough, comports with the Targum. And and what that tells us is it was a talking head. It was somebody's head, it was a shrunken head that was taken as a treasure, and that's what they were using for idolatry. Now, when you get in, now here's the criticism. Let's get into the criticism. The criticism has to do, I think, the primary criticism has to do with the nature of the Aramaic language. And the Aramaic language tends to be pretty flexible, like even more flexible than the Greek or the Hebrew. It's like English has a great deal of flexibility. You put one word out there, well, it could mean a lot of things. And it's the same thing in the Aramaic. There's a lot of flexibility in their pronouns and in their proper nouns and so forth. And so because of that, you get this, the translating license, shall we say, a bit broader. Zen, what's your take on that?
Well, when it comes to being able to read the Hebrew and the Aramaic, that is an ability I wish that I had. And I, give great respect for individuals like yourself, Dr. P, that do understand those kind of nuances. But myself, do not have the capability. And so, I would defer to you with regard to some of that. But again, with examining the reason why I believe people should study and to examine, it's like, the whole telephone game of the further you get away from the original source and the original truth, the more things are altered and changed. And I believe that reading the English translation of the Aramaic Targum, which was made available to us by J.W. Etheridge in 1862, that it helps us to get back closer to the original source, and that, of course, utilizing discernment, but in reading and studying from this rendition, that we find great in detail and elaboration on much of what is available in the King James. And I'm meaning like every passage and every chapter and every verse, and so many things which are ambiguous to us with regard to the stories of the biblical narrative and the lives of the ancient patriarchs are clarified in great detail, again, within the Targum manuscripts. It's like, reading when you study the legends of the patriarchs and the prophets, or the legends of the Jews, the traditions of the Jews, these ancient books like, even Jasher and Jubilees, which also provide a greater detail on some of the different biblical stories that, again, studying this, what I believe to be the most ancient translation of the Hebrew Torah into a different language, and that being Aramaic, which was the language that the Israelites were utilizing during the time that Christ walked here upon the earth. I mean, in my opinion, you can't get closer to the original source, because as Ezra revealed to us, the original Hebrew and the original scrolls and manuscripts were destroyed with the temple during the destruction of 587 BC. And so examining these manuscripts with, at least you get another source, and a very ancient source, to consider when studying and reading alongside the modern English and also the Greek Septuagint.
So it acts as a comparison, and
Yeah,
it
it's like
helps
a
us.
parallel study.
Yeah, parallel study, right. Helps us to compare and to contrast in order to enhance our studies. I think that's absolutely necessary. So, what are some of the differences that you find regarding that translation and the translations that we have available to us today? I mean, Dr. Pidgeon, you were going to give me some quotes. Unfortunately, I don't have them, but some very important elements that are located in the Targums are found only in the Targums that you cannot find in modern translations.
Well, I was just sharing with you the story on the teraphim, and the
Talk to me.
teraphim is very interesting because let's talk about the teraphim for just
Let's do
a
it.
minute. You have this very interesting story, right? Which is that you have Yaakov who is going to leave, and he's leaving Laban because he's fed up with working for the guy, right? He worked 7 years to marry Rachel or Raquel, and he ends up marrying Leah, who turned out to be a fabulous wife and mother. And he has to work another 7 years to marry Raquel, which he does. And then he does another 6 years. So he's there a total of 20 years working for Laban, building his crops and building his herds and so forth. Laban becomes very wealthy. In fact, the passage says that he was blessed because Yaakov was there working. But at one night, Yaakov says, that's it, we're out of here. We're going, we're leaving. And so he packs up his 2 wives, his 2 concubines, all their children, and they leave. And as they're leaving, they're being pursued by Laban, who comes and says, hey, wait a minute, you ran off with my idols. And Yaakov says, well, look, any person who ran off with your idols, let that person be killed. Little does he know it's Raquel,
right,
his beloved one, who ran off with the idols. And the only thing that protected her was the fact that she had the idols stored in her camel furniture, the saddle that sat on top of the camel. She had them stored in there, and she wasn't going to get off the camel. So what happens is she manages to keep the idols. But Laban tells her, I believe this is in the Targum, he relates that it was one of those heads that told him that she was the one that ran off the other idols. And so only in the Targum, with the exception of the book of Jasher, do you get this discussion about who these teraphim are. That you would behead your enemy, and then you keep the head. We talked about this before, about talking heads being named after this, that they would keep the head and they would use the head as an idol. They'd put the head up in their tent, wherever, and they would talk to it. Tell me about what you see. And then
like an oracle.
Like an oracle. And then the head would come back, like maybe a Ouija board or something. I don't know. Yeah. But the head would come back and say something to them. And then they would get a prophecy from these talking heads. Now, these teraphims, there is no instruction in the Torah to behead your enemy, right? It says, you're supposed to burn or hang or stone, but there's no beheading. And yet you have this practice of beheading. You have these idols that are showing up from beheaded people. And what does David do with Goliath, right? Yeah. He beheads him and he takes the skull with him. Goliath of Gath, ends up being Golgotha in the New Testament. Golgotha, the place of the skull where the site of the crucifixion was. That's one example. Zen, I know you've got many, many more.
Yes. Well, the first thing I want to make mention of is a book that my son just released as well. It's called The Word of the Lord, a comparative analysis of the hidden memra. And the memra is a word that is used in the Targum, and it's an allusion to Christ as being the Logos, the Word of the Lord God. And we see that in the Targum translation and in this book that he just released, that there is in just the first 5 books of Moshe, the Pentateuch, there are 216 allusions to the word of the Lord found in the scriptures of these first 5 books. And yet when you study and look at and keyword search for the word of the Lord or anything to do with the word in the King James Version of the Bible, you have only 11 such renditions. And so somehow in translation 11 times or 206 times, you have disappearing the reference to the word of the Lord and to his interaction with the early patriarchs and his basically establishing and bringing forth Israel as a nation of prophets. And there are so many critical occurrences of the word of the Lord, even being in the garden and with Adam and Eve. I mean, so much. And yet, all of this is hidden and misinterpreted, mistranslated, and misconstrued. In my opinion, it is because those that did do the later translations, they are trying to hide the fact that Christ is found mentioned all over the place within the early books of the Torah, and that he had uh, his presence with the lives of the early patriarchs is very deeply profound. And so, again, it's another one of those things of um, like the book of Enoch, because it contains the messianic prophecies of the Son of Man
Mhm.
and him being the elect one, that so many try to declare that it was written after the coming of Christ into flesh, and that they were not messianic, when it's clear, being found part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that they were confirmed to be earlier, and that they are in fact messianic in nature. And the Targum are also similar. And that's just one instance. And so it's also found that in the Targum of Isaiah and the Targum of Psalms, there are 60 mentions to the word of the Lord, which are not found in the English translations that are available to us in the King James Version of the Bible. And so my son put out all of these instances and put them side by side for people that are interested. You can look at the Aramaic rendition of these different passages, and then look at the King James. And you will notice first that not only is there much more detail and greater elaboration to much of the stories that are connected to Christ as the Logos and his interaction with the patriarchs in Israel, but that in many instances the link to him has been completely removed and completely altered, and um, tampered in a way so as to hide uh, the direct link to him as Savior Messiah. And so, if it was just a few times that this kind of occurrence had happened, you could consider it possibly accidental. But the fact that you have this being done numerous, over 200 times, is, in my opinion, absolutely showing that they are trying to hide the connections of Christ as the Logos to, the early lives and the early interaction with the Torah, and the fact that Moshe and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of them refer to the word of the Lord as their helper, and that even the covenant with Abraham was made in the name of the word of the Lord. So many things like that. But you want to
Excellent.
comment?
Well, I have I pulled up Justin's book here on your website. So for those of you who are interested and would like to have access to this book, you can find it on sacredwordpublishing.com. This is written by Justin Garcia. That's Zen's son. And here's just a basic synopsis of what it is. But as Zen went ahead and described its contents, you can determine for yourself. What's interesting is that I find that the Targums sort of have a lean towards a personification of who Yahusha is. And you mentioned something, Zen, about sort of veiling aspects of who Yahusha is. And Dr. Pidgeon has talked many times about the Roman Reich and how their order is that they would usurp that position and declare themselves to be gods on earth. And so we see that some of the contents of scripture has been skewed in order to depict a personification that is not accurate. For example, today we have a concept of who Jesus is, and in this particular concept or personification is one in which this Jesus is somewhat rebellious to the Torah, the laws of Yahuwah, has done away with them, has proclaimed that grace superior to obedience. There seems to be a lot of confusion about this, and we see that division and that line of demarcation actually present between those who adhere to and have come to the conclusion that the Torah is for us today, and then those who have determined that the Torah, in fact, is evil, and those who come under its submission are in bondage or have returned to bondage. And so we see that division taking place even today. That's
Right.
that demarcation, right? And so I think a lot of that has to do, like you said, with the interpretation and the language depicting a personification of the Messiah himself. And so returning to these ancient texts, or Dr. Pidgeon had mentioned the other night, the ancient paths, right? He had talked about the Celtic people and this revival that will take place, but this revival will be to return to those things which were once hidden, the ancient paths. And so here we find on the path these ancient texts that may have been reserved for us in these latter days in order to get a better perspective of who our Messiah is. And according to the Targums, we see a Mashiach, or a Messiah, who is obedient to and even encourages, as Dr. P, you mentioned in that quote there by Ezra, that we are to adhere to and be obedient, for obedience is much better than sacrifice. But we see those things again being reiterated and even supporting what we're doing today, because it's monumental what's happening. This is a shift in not only paradigm, but it's a major shift.
No, this is a major shift, Jessica. And I mean, I don't want to, blow this shofar too loud, if you know what I mean. But I can tell you that this is a significant shift. When we had, what took place with the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther, around 1500, and what took place with the, people protesting the Catholic Church, that was the Reformation. Now, what this era is now is the Restoration. It's the Restoration, and this Restoration is such a big deal because, look, we're at the precipice of death. Okay. We are at the precipice of death because of people who have failed, because the truth has been disguised, because the truth has been buried, because wicked men have used what they could in order to obtain power over other people, instead of allowing the word to speak for itself. And millions, hundreds of millions have been killed and slaughtered behind these quests for power, right? Now, for the first time, because of this information explosion that's going on, the rest of the story is being told. And because the rest of the story is being told, we are seeing a paradigm shift. It's a paradigmatic shift. It's of massive proportion. It is the Restoration. I want to say this because I know we have a lot of friends in Europe and in the UK who are almost all in bed right now, right? It's only 3 or 4 in the morning over there, right?
Tomorrow.
Right, it's tomorrow.
Later on today.
But when they catch the video, maybe tomorrow evening, I just want to share this with them. There is very good news coming, and I know a lot of the Europeans are saying, what are we going to do? I mean, we've lost to Islam. We've lost to the darkness. We've lost to the Mashiach deniers. We've lost everything. We lost our culture. We've lost all of the things of civilization, all of these parameters that have been pushed out over the last 500 years as a result of breaking somewhat the leash with Rome. Well, now the rest of the leash has to be shed. It has to be shed. And part of what's shedding this is these extra scriptural books, because we're seeing it just like this book that Justin wrote. What an incredibly important book that is. It's an incredibly important book, because now you have these people who have, you take a 66 book canon and you let it sit out there for a while. And the naysayers about Mashiach are pick, chisel, erase, scratch, argue. And then they can say, well, of the prophecies in Isaiah 53, those really didn't amount to anything. And Paul was a liar and Peter's a fraud and blah, 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 blah. And they're able to take apart the 66 books because there are many premises in the 66 books that do not have a second witness.
There you go.
Right?
Absolutely.
But all of a sudden, with the book of Jasher showing up, the book of Jubilees showing up, the book of Hanok showing up, second Baruch showing up, 4 Ezra showing up, Boom.
Gospel of Thomas and Nag Hammadi. You got the Essene Gospels, which leads us into our next topic that I will let Zen go ahead and introduce. It's something very new. So I've never heard of it, and I'm always studying. That's my job. I say, do you have a job? Yeah, it's to study. But Zen, you brought this to our attention. I'm not even sure if I'm going to say it right, but the Thracian Chronicles, and then Dr. Pidgeon will go ahead and get into the Kolbrin. Again, two very interesting texts that we are going to examine tonight and see why these will add to. And so the Thracian scripts decoded the Chronicles. I'll pull that up while you're going, while you give it an introduction. Dan.
Actually, before we do that,
Yeah.
I just want to share a couple of particular instances as to what I was alluding to and to provide a few specific passages. And I
Sure.
wanted to bring up one other thing with regard to the variation in the
Please.
Targum for people to have consideration.
Yep.
First, in allusion to the word of the Lord, I'll just share a couple of instances here. And like I said, there are 216 found in the Aramaic Targum, which I do encourage people to read and study in fullness, and to please get the book that Justin put out, because I do believe it to be a profound work, and one that, especially for disciples of Christ, will strengthen your faith in a way that not the few other books would really be able to do.
I'll pull
So.
it back up here while you're doing that. Go ahead.
Okay, and so it says, and the word of the Lord created man in his likeness. In the likeness of the presence of the Lord, he created him. The male and his yokefellow, he created them. In the image of the Lord, he created him with 248 members, with 365 nerves, and overlaid them with skin, and filled it with flesh and blood, and male and female in their bodies, he created them. So, this again, Genesis 1:26 allusion, and it says that the word of the Lord is he that created these pre-Adamites. And so that's just one instance. Another, and a garden from the Eden of the just was planted by the word of the Lord God before the creation of the world. And he made there to dwell the man when he had created him. And the Lord God made to grow from the ground every tree that was desirable to behold and good to eat, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, whose height was a journey of 500 years, and the tree of whose fruit they who ate would distinguish between good and evil. And so this is a reference to the word of the Lord, Christ creating paradise before the world was made. And then after he had created modern Adam and Eve, placed them there into paradise as well. And that's where they fell from. One last one for consideration. And they heard the voice of the word of the Lord God walking in the garden in the repose of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from before the Lord God among the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, is not all the world which I have made manifest before me, the darkness as the light? And how hast thou thought in thine heart to hide from before me? The place where thou art concealed, do I not see? Where are the commandments that I commanded thee? And so, here we see that God knows where they are because he's omnipotent, omnipresence. And, it's the word of the Lord walking with the Father in the garden in the repose of the day. And, he calls forth and tells them to come out of their hiding places. Whereas in the King James, you get a sense that he's calling for them, but doesn't know where they are. And so it doesn't show that omnipotence and the as far as him being omnipresent as well. Now, I don't have this passage before me, but I do know it by heart, and I'll bring up one other thing. But in Isaiah chapter 45, where it speaks about the Lord, and I'll actually pull this up afterwards too and read it in great detail, but where it says that God created the light and the darkness, and that he created good and evil. In the Targum, that is not what it says at all. And so many people allude to this passage and say, oh, well, this proves that God created evil as well. But what it says in the Targum is that God created light and darkness, and he created good and punishment for evil. And so that makes it completely different when you read and you examine the context of that particular passage. And I'll bring it up, but before I do, I want to go ahead and go to one other variation, which I believe is important. And it was one of the reasons why I began to write the book on the serpent seed. And it has to do with the King James chapter 3 through 5. And I'll just read a couple verses.
What I'll pull it up for you. So what chapter and verse?
King James chapter 3,
King
verse
James?
15. Yeah, the
King, what's the book?
chapter 3,
I don't know.
Genesis. Oh,
King
sorry,
James.
Genesis. Yeah,
Thank
Genesis.
you.
Sorry.
Genesis, what verse? Chapter and verse?
Chapter 3 and verse 15.
Okay, go ahead.
And where it says in the King James, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. In the Targum, it says, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between the seed of thy son and the seed of her sons. And it shall be when the sons of the woman keep the commandments of the law, they will be prepared to smite thee upon thy head. But when they forsake the commandments of the law, that will be ready to wound them in their heel. And so, specific where it says between the seed of thy son and the seed of her sons, it's my opinion that God had already foreseen that the consequences of Adam and Eve and the serpent, for him tempting them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that she was already pregnant with what would be Cain, who was of the wicked one. And that's why he said here, between the seed of thy son, Cain, speaking to the serpent, and the seed of her sons. And it says her sons because Cain would kill Abel, and then 130 years later, Adam and Eve would bear Sheth, and his name meaning compensation, replacement, and substitution, and that it would be through Sheth that the line of Adam would propagate. And Cain and his bloodline are found in Genesis chapter 4, separated from the children of Adam, which we get a greater sense of that here in, you can go to Genesis 4:1. And then I'll read just these last two passages to show connections to this particular verse. And in the Genesis 4:1, which is the passage most people use to refute the idea of serpent seed, it says, and Adam knew Eve, his wife, semicolon, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. In the Targum, it says, and Adam knew Hava, his wife, Hava meaning life giver in the Hebrew, who had desired the angel, semicolon, and she conceived and bare Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man from the angel of the Lord. And she added to bear from her husband Adam, his twin, even Abel. And so, this particular passage, which contains who had desired the angel, which has been left out, when you understand the premise of serpent seed and that it was the serpent that beguiled Eve, and that's why she lost her chastity, as Paul references in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 2 and 3, that this is why she actually says, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the angel of the Lord. Because it says in other places that Samael is the angel, the viper of God, who became Satan the adversary, that is the father of Cain. And that's why Cain was of wicked disposition and that he had a seraphic appearance. And that this is, again, it makes greater sense why she would say, I have acquired a man from the angel of the Lord. Because when you read even the commentaries, which I can share a couple, that this is what is being spoke of, that Cain was the fulfillment of, I will put enmity between thy seed and her seed, and that the seed of the serpent begins with Cain as the wicked one, and then you have Abel being the firstborn son of Adam, who being killed by his half brother was replaced with Sheth. And we see that in two interpretations. I'll read this really quick and then one final passage from the
Absolutely. And just an FYI, I do have a copy of the Targum pseudo Jonathan here on my eSword. So as you're commenting on the verses in the Targum, I'm bringing it up, and it does state here. I will read it for our audience quickly, and it says, "And Adam, the man, knew Chava, his wife, who had desired the Melachim, the angel, and she conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man, the angel of Yahuwah. And she added to bear from her husband Adam, his twin, even Habal. And Habal was a shepherd of the flock." And it goes on. So, wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And so Johann Eisenmenger, in his Traditions of the Jews, which was released in 1700, was actually rounded up and burned by all those that were against the serpent seed
The
doctrine.
doctrine.
Which
Yeah.
it was I believe it was this one emperor, and he was trying to keep this knowledge hidden. But then there was a copy that was released 40 years later, and it says about Genesis 4:1, the interpretation, and Adam knew his wife who had conceived by the angel Samael was pregnant and bare Cain, whose resemblance was like the upper creatures and not like the
Mhm.
lower. And she said, I have gotten the man, the angel of the Lord. In the Legends of the Jews from Lois Ginsburg, he says of this verse, Cain's descent from Satan, who is the angel Samael, was revealed in his seraphic appearance. At his birth, the exclamation was wrung from Eve, I have gotten a man through an angel of the Lord, which is exactly what Samael was. He was an angel of the Lord.
Mm.
But one last thing, go to Genesis 5,
Okay.
chapter 5, verses 1 through 4.
Genesis, hang on just a second.
Yeah.
One more time, please.
Genesis chapter 5,
Mm-hmm.
verses 1 through 4.
You got it. All right, go ahead.
All right. In the King James, it says, This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man. In the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness and after his image and called his name Sheth. In the Targum, in Genesis chapter 5, it says, This is the book of the genealogy of man. In the day that the Lord created man, in the likeness of the Lord, he made him. Male and female, he created them and blessed them in the name of his word. And he called their name man in the day they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begat Sheth, who had the likeness of his image and of his similitude. For before had Hava borne Cain, who was not like to him, and Abel was killed by his hand. And Cain was cast out, neither is his seed genealized in the book of the genealogy of Adam. But afterwards there was one born like him, and he called his name Sheth. And so we see that it is emphasized that Cain was not in the similitude or likeness or was born of Adam, but that, Abel was and being killed by his hand, then Sheth, again, his name meaning compensation, substitution, and replacement, was born afterwards. And Cain was cast out, neither is his seed genealized in the book of the genealogy of Adam. And so when you understand that Samael, the viper of God, the angel of death, is the father of Cain, then it makes sense that in Genesis chapter 4:1, you see that verse being the beginning of the chapter where you find Cain's generations, the 10 generations born of him. It begins there and is separated from Genesis chapter 5, which is that chapter that speaks about the 10 generations of Adam and his children. And so we see this distinction and differentiation is even encoded and preserved in the King James when you understand the fullness of the passage as it relates to these two bloodlines. And that, this is again is why it says in Genesis 3:15, even in the King James, that God is going to put enmity, speaking to the serpent, that he's going to put enmity between his children and the children of the woman, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that we see this war and this enmity playing out all throughout the scriptures when you have this understanding. And again, it's very clear, and it's preserved in the Targum, which again I believe is the oldest translation and the most authoritative of those available to us for modern consideration.
Very interesting. I'm actually of the same belief. However, I found this information to be hidden in the language itself. So when you remove what the outer layer of the specific language, you can find these things actually hidden covertly beneath them, beneath the language. And so, Dr. Pidgeon, you're sitting there quietly. I know we only have Zen for a little while. Zen, as long as your voice holds up, let us know when you have to go. I do want to get into the Thracian scripts.
Absolutely.
And I also want to, maybe we can talk a little bit about the Kolbrin. I know Dr. Pidgeon has brought it up several times, but I want to see, exactly how that works into the historical aspect of our awakening today, because it's putting a lot of the pieces together. But you're sitting there quietly. Dr. Pidgeon, would you like to remark on some of what Zen said? Again, we don't always have to agree here. We respect and love each other. I think that we are demonstrating that love towards one another and giving you, the audience, an opportunity to search these things out for yourself to determine what is being revealed to you in the spirit of truth. And so before we move on to that Thracian script, Dr. Pidgeon, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think what Zen is saying, when you present the Targum, what you're presenting is an explanation of what the authors of the Targum believed the scripture to say. And I think it's very important that the concept was that this was the concept. Now, we know there's some very interesting things out there, and I've had this discussion with other people too about the twins, right? You have a similar situation with Esau and Jacob.
Sure.
That it's possible to have a dual parentage, and I forget what the technical name is for it. But
Heteropaterno superfecundation.
It is right.
There you go.
On the side of the seed. Mm-hmm.
Now we've got the name. So what it amounts to is that it's very possible, even today, for a woman to have twins, to have a twin pregnancy from two different fathers.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I've got to tell you now, while we talk about these things, and of course, when I look at this, people say, well, it's possible that Esau and Jacob had two different fathers. Well, I'm not going to be rewriting the Torah in the Sefer, okay? Right. Especially when I don't have a text I can look to and say, well, this is an authoritative text and so on. But when you look at, I just want to share this a little bit with the Kolbrin, all right? When you look at the Kolbrin Bible, now the Kolbrin, again, you have a text here that the Kolbrin Trusts says that this text it comes from ancient Egyptian sources. Now, my friend in Wales, Ross Broadstock, has just released a book. He's calling it Qumric Hieroglyphics, or Qumric Glyphics, or something to this effect. It's a brilliant name, and it's a great book. And he demonstrates about the Qumric language, the Welsh language, being capable of interpreting Egyptian hieroglyphics. That they're able to, they're able to put the letters back and forth and able to read the stuff in the Welsh language. So this is very interesting that you would have such an immediate connect from even modern Welsh back to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, to the point that Alan Wilson was able to read the Black Obelisk in Welsh after he translated the hieroglyphs.
Wow.
Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that there is an ancient record out there that corroborates some interesting things. Now, I want to read just a little bit of a passage, just a little bit, out of the Kolbrin, okay? This is the Kolbrin, and this is chapter 5. It's called The Destroyer. This is from the scroll of Edetha, one of the scrolls that's contained in the Kolbrin. It says, the doom shape called the Destroyer in Egypt was seen in all the lands whereabouts. In color, it was bright and fiery, in appearance changing and unstable. It twisted about itself like a coil, like water bubbling into a pool from an underground supply. And all men agreed it was the most fearsome sight. It was not a great comet or a lucent star, being more like a fiery body of flame. Now, what's being said here, what is discussed here at this point, in the Kolbrin is this discussion of the kind of events that took place with this destroyer being present in the heavens, what took place in Egypt at the time of the Exodus. And it goes on to name the parties, but Moses had a different name. The Pharaoh had a different name. And there were a ton of different names there in place that are used in this ancient Egyptian text that is retained in the Kolbrin. And it talks about, so now the Kolbrin's been around for a long time, a lot longer than, let's say, the discussion about Planet X and Zechariah Sitchin's and Nibiru and all this kind of thing. But, we do know that Guru Broussard has spent a lot of time documenting this stuff, its historical references. And then he points to the fact that, initially he thought it was a planet or a planetary system, or maybe it's a comet. But here the Kolbrin's telling us point blank, no, it's not a comet. No, it's not a planetary system. It's some kind of coiling thing. And the effects of this coiling thing in Egypt at the time, as described in the Kolbrin, is enormous. I mean, it was total anarchy. Nobody cared about living. Nobody cared about rules, restrictions, or anything else. And the Pharaoh didn't care about running the empire at all. He didn't care. Nobody cared because it was so destructive, so incredibly fearsome that people, of course, were hiding in caves. It was Moshe at this point that calls out the people of the house of Yasharel and says, I'm going to bring law and order. We're going to pull out of it. We're getting out of here, So again, you're talking about a record. Now, can I verify this record from any other source? No, I can't. But you can look at this record and you can say, if you're reading with discernment, you can look at this record and go, this appears to have a number of things that are being said here. Okay. Like I was reading out of the Kolbrin today, and I'll give you another example. This one really surprised me, really shocked me. Because, Jessica, we have talked about, microchimerism, right? And microchimerism is...
Are we on the Kolbrin? Let me pull it up. Are we going to go there?
Yeah, but I don't know if I can give you the exact scriptural site for this in the Kolbrin.
It's okay. I have the website for the Graham Hancock official website. You want to look at that? Go ahead.
But what you see in the Kolbrin, it starts talking about this teaching of Yosira. Yosira is the name they use. And then in this teaching of Yosira, he's talking about adultery. And he says, a woman should not commit adultery. And the reason a woman should not commit adultery is because, and I'll be kind of explicit here, and I sure hope I don't offend anybody. But he says, basically, when the seed is resident from one man and another seed appears, it creates an anomaly, and it creates a destructive anomaly inside the child that's birthed. Now, since then, we've talked about, and science has really come forward since the mapping of the genome. So you're not talking here with something that was known in 1990. You're talking about something that's, basically this century, since we've obtained this information, that they have discovered what's called microchimerism. And microchimerism is this idea of resident DNA of being in place, which affects the fertilized ovum. Yeah. So to the point that you have, and so a lot of the stuff that we talk about, this is what's so good.
Very similar to epigenetics.
It's very similar to epigenetics.
Transfer of genetic data. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you've had all the microbiology you've had, Jessica. You handle these topics really well. But I can tell you, Zen's talking about it here when we talk about the seed of the serpent. And of course, a lot of people jumped on the idea, well, you can't have the seed of the serpent because you're trying to say that angels had seed. Well, you have this record in Genesis 6:14 that tells you that, angels had seed. And in fact, in the Sefer, we started looking, and you were mentioning this too, Jessica, that you were talking about the fact that you can find it, you can discover a lot of this truth by looking at the underlying language.
Yeah.
Now, I can tell you, and when we looked at 6:14, we discovered something that was shocking, which was this word nafal.
Right.
Not Nephilim, but Naphalim, not the fallen ones, right? The fallen ones who had gone from eternity, who La'olam had gone from eternity to become mortal men. They went from eternity to become mortal men. They shed the heavenly body to become mortal men. Now, do I know that Samael did this? I don't know that. But what we can talk about here, when we start talking about the seed of man, the seed of the woman, the seed of and her sons, the seed of the serpent and those sons, when you begin talking about this, or even the idea of passing your children through to Molech, right? That was most likely a form of microchimerism, where you have additional DNA coming in. You've got You got different DNA that's taking place. Now, do we
No.
understand this from a scientific point of view? 100%? Absolutely not. But we have something as a scriptural record that is pointing to something that we don't know. You know, everybody, you know, in our, you know, in the 20th century, I can remember in the 1970s, and I know you weren't even born at that time, but I can remember during that decade, the United States thought that we knew everything there was to know on Earth and in the universe. I mean, we had 100% of the knowledge, and we would sneer and snicker at how stupid those people were in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century. And as it turns out, we didn't know anything. We didn't know anything. We still don't know anything. And, you know, so.
You know, it's interesting, again, in the language, I'll just give you an example before we transition here. But I'll give you an example of one word that, again, connects those dots that Zen was talking about here. Remember when the children were in the wilderness and they were craving the meat of the bird, and Yahuwah had given it to them in that place in the desert. What was it? The quail. And
yes.
Right. And so, and they gorged on it to the point where, it came forth out of their nostrils, and they were, purging it out because, again, the desire of their heart was for this thing. Well, they named that place Kibroth Ha, meaning the, and this is interesting, Ta'ava. Kibroth ha ta'ava. Kibroth ha ta'ava. You can find it at the Index Strong 6914. But what's interesting is we find in Genesis this word ha, the, ta'ava, is also mentioned in regards to the interaction between the woman and the serpent. And there's so much between Genesis 3:6, what's actually happening here, and what Yahuwah says is pleasant to the eye. There's an anomaly there, actually. And I also teach this from, again, the language perspective. But it says here, and then when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and again, in the English translation, we see pleasant to the eyes, as it was something to be, looked upon as lovely. But in the case here, this word pleasant is, guess what? Ta'ava. Now, the interpretation of this term, kibruth ha'atava, actually means this: the graves of desire, specifically intimate relationships, if you will. And I'm sure that you understand that type of longing. So here we see that being interpreted as something that is more intimated. Dr. Pidgeon, specifically the lust of the eyes. But it does make a reference to and I'll go on here, the satisfaction or a charm, to be charmed by something, but to give into that desire that is to lust for, to covet, and to desire it from a different perspective than just simply it's pleasant to the eye. No, we get a different perspective here. And again, it's mentioned again in that verse where they're eating of the quail. So we see a lot of nuances that tie in through the language itself. So I think it's important, especially when Zen is talking about the Targums actually being an interpretation of scripture, right? An interpretation. And you're saying that you're showing us in the beginning, you were showing us how it could be related to the tribe of Reuben, right? And how
no, I didn't get into that, but
we didn't get into that. Oh, goodness.
To touch on it for just a minute, because
sure,
we did touch on the Kasdim, and we touched on the Chaldeans. Now, the Kasdim, this becomes so important because as the Aramaic language rises through this region, right? And we see that Maacah is the son of Nahor, a Kasdim, and that it's very likely that the Maccabim were of this tribe of Maacah, and so were in fact Kasdim. That means that the Hasmonean dynasty that would restore the nation of Judea, although they were restoring it as Judea, they were in fact Kasdim. They were Magi. They were the astrologers. They were of the house of Nahor. They were. And so we get this concept that Nahor was like, well, I kind of see where Abraham's coming from. And, I'm not going to get rid of all my idols, but, we're going to kind of follow this stuff. And so you get a lot of writing in the Babylonian literature, and you get a lot of discussion, and you see the Kasdim replace the Judeans. You see, we're here. And even though we're Kasdim, we're going to ascribe to this literature, which is now in Aramaic, this Aramaic literature telling us about what the covenant is, telling us about what the Torah is, telling us about this. Why? Because it's our native language. Now, these same Kasdim would eventually form the Hittite Empire, the Hittite Empire would eventually move into Europe, and these Kasdim or Chaldeans would become known as Chaldees or Celtic people. The Celtic people who were in Central Europe as far as France, these Chaldees, Kasdim of the Hittite Empire that had come out of Haran, right? As out of the land of Ur. So when we see this thing that these Kasdim are doing this, and that this is where they're coming from, and this is what happened at the time of the Hasmonean dynasty, right? Now we begin to see this entire influence that is going to take place. Now, one thing that happened during the destruction of the House of the Northern Kingdom, this happened around before 722 BC, was, of course, of this business of taking the 3 tribes that were to the east of the Jordan into captivity first. So there were 3 tribes that were to the east of the Jordan. There was Gad, right? Gad, a lot of people say, if you're from London, Gad. But if you're from everywhere else in the world, Gad, the tribe of Reuben, and the tribe of Manasseh, or the half-tribe of Manasseh. The half-tribe of Manasseh, fearsome fighting tribe. They put them up there to block everybody else from coming down because they were so ferocious. But they were taken into captivity, and they were taken far out to the other side of the Caspian Sea. Get those guys out of here. The house of Reuben was not. The house of Reuben was only taken into what we call Iran now today. And the son of Reuben, the firstborn son of Reuben, was a son named Carmi. All right. And of course, Gad, what happens to Gad is taken up over the river Sabaton, which was we now call the whatever it is, the Bosphorus, that divides Europe and Asia. And they're actually up into Europe and would eventually come to populate Morocco and Sicily and etc. Anyway, that's another story. What we're interested in here is what happened to Reuben. So Reuben, it becomes identified as the son Carmi. Carmi goes and forms a town, a city that's still there in Iran today, called Carmi. And this town would become a fighting town. These guys were very interested in being warriors. Now, Hitler would come to look at these guys and say, this is our Aryan root. And this is why Persia became Iran, which, of course, in Persian language is Aryan, right? Aryan in Persian, Iran. And Hitler would look and say, this is our roots, we're Aryan. And he would point here to this area. But when he was talking about Aryan, what was he talking about? He was talking about Carmi. Well, Carmi, Josephus identifies the Carmanians, not as Carmanians, but Germanians. Germanians.
Wow.
And so what you see now, what you see going on in Europe right now, this is not to give Germans any grief, okay? But what you see going on in Europe, and it's been going on for a long time since we talked about the Roman Empire, right? We talked about the Roman Empire, the rise of Charlemagne, and how that was a Germanic empire that lasted for 1,000 years, the Second Reich, and that Hitler was intent upon creating the Third Reich to last for 1,000 years to allow who? The Germans to govern Europe as the Germans had governed Europe under the Holy Roman Empire created by Charlemagne, as the Germans had governed Europe under the Italian domination called the Roman Empire, right? So what do we get? Why? Because it is the house of Reuben. And the house of Reuben was the firstborn. Reuben was supposed to get the birthright.
Yes.
Wow.
And he didn't get the birthright. The reason he didn't get the birthright is because he went up to his father's couch.
Yeah.
First Chronicles 5:1.
Primogenitor, yeah.
But the Germans have this in their soul. We have to, we're the oldest here. We have to dominate. We have to be the ones to control. And to this day, the EU is dominated, of course, by the Germans who want to have their culture. They want to have their say about what the society. Sure. They want their economy
dominating. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a dominating force, like an older brother, older sister comes in. I'm the older brother. I'm telling you guys.
I'm back. Give me my seat. That's my seat. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah, you know what I mean, right?
And you see this throughout history, and it's interesting. We're going to get into this in another show. But Dr. Pidgeon, you're actually doing a lot of research regarding this particular topic, which I look forward to hosting. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later down the line. And again, how it pertains to those who are actually occupying the land at this present time. And, we have heard stories. We're going to talk about that 13th tribe, and we've heard about the Khazarian Jews, and their, interpretation of Judaism, and maybe even the Rothschilds, and again, clarifying who's who and what's what. in our time and date. And so, gosh, that's so exciting. What do you have to say about that, Zen? And what is this Thracian scripts? I don't want to let you go without you talking about this particular manuscript.
Oh yeah, no. With regard to the 13 tribe and
Yeah.
the Khazarians, and
God, this is good stuff.
we, in my opinion, again, even with the elites of being all one bloodline and having utilized the divine right to rule, in my opinion, it's connected to what we see revealed in Matthew 13, where Christ shared the parable of the sower and the kingdom and the tares of the field. And he said of the tares, that they are the children of the enemy, the wicked one. And
Serpents.
to allow both to grow together until the time of the end. And that at the time of the end, he would send his angels forth as reapers to gather the tares first for burning and the wheat for preservation. And so, in my opinion, even in this day and age, we are contending with this enmity that goes back to Cain and Abel and to the garden. And even as I cover it in my great contest books, that it links to even the rebellion of the angels, Lucifer and the 1/3 that joined him in insurgency, the war in heaven, and that the division of light and darkness, and what I believe was the destruction of the earth in Genesis 1-2, where the earth became Hayat Watobu Wabohu, became a deserted wasteland and indistinguishable ruin. That war in heaven led to that
Sure.
destruction and the reformation that we see in Genesis 1-3 and onward.
Hang on right there, Zen. Hang on. I had mentioned this to Dr. Pidgeon, and we said, because we have so many topics we want to study, but I'm just going to bring it up. Please don't stone me. No one stone me. But listen, I, for a long time, have tried to study this fact out, or this matter out, based on that tohu vabohu. However, I come along, and there's a lot of impasses. However, I want to bring this topic up. The first Earth age. I mean, is it a thing? Is it a thing? Is it a thing? The first Earth age, the second Earth age. We got a third Earth age, perhaps being the millennia. But could it be possible that there is a first Earth age? And even mentioned in Jeremiah, when he talks about a city that existed prior to that which Adam occupied. Oof. You heard of this first Earth age?
Oh yeah, I've heard of this. I've heard of this theory, and I mean, the language in Genesis 1 does not rule it out. It doesn't
Right.
rule it out, and I mean, and of course, there's a fantastic book out there written by scientists called "In 6 Days," and there are a whole group of PhDs, 50 PhDs that wrote this book that believe that creation was 6 days long exactly. And they set forth the reasons why they believe that. Now, I tend to ascribe to that view. However,
A first Earth age?
yeah, but if you're talking about and I believe that there's also a pattern to Yah's timing. I think that there is a 6,000 year period from the creation of Adam, return of Mashiach, and that we're very close to the closing of those 6,000 years. Now, if there was something that was going on before Adam, before he breathed life into those nostrils, and that there was other life on earth and other things that happened, I mean, it's very possible, but it's also possible that the record we're seeing on earth today as the antediluvian record is being exposed, right? That's what's being exposed, the antediluvian record. And what we're seeing is what? Hieroglyphs of helicopters and submarines, ancient hieroglyphs of A-bombs and mushroom clouds and flying machines that toys that were found in these ancient places that are actual flying aircraft and so forth. Runways being found, for instance, in the Peruvian desert and so forth. I mean, all of that stuff gives rise to the notion that there was an extremely advanced civilization in the antediluvian period.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very possible that, especially when you read in Hanok, that says the Watchers disclosed what they knew.
Oof.
So when they get here in the 7th generation, they're teaching mankind. We get Hanok saying, well, they taught this, they taught that, they taught this, but that's just kind of a generalized summary, right? This is what I can remember what they taught. But how much did they teach? Did they teach flying machines? Did they teach? Did they teach digital technology? Did they teach us? We know that they have a Babylonian battery. We know that the pyramids probably meant something entirely different.
Yeah, they look like chips. You have a bird's eye view. It seems like these entities were always trying to kickstart something. And even with Yahusha, many times they tried to capture him, and Yahusha would say, hey, it's not my time, right? They were always trying to kickstart something. But Zen, I'm sorry to sidetrack you there, but you can continue with your presentation there. First Earth Age, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. In my opinion, the language clearly denotes, and as well as the study of the extra biblical text, even in Isaiah chapter 45, he reveals that God created the earth perfect. In Second Esdras, it also speaks about
Excellent.
and that um, why then would you see in Genesis 1:2, looking at the Hebrew, that
Right.
all of a sudden the earth becomes a deserted wasteland and an indistinguishable ruin? And
Yeah.
that word ruin implies something consequentially happening that led to it becoming in that state. And
Right.
so, in my opinion, unless you understand about the first world age, and even in Second Peter, I believe that he is making mention of, and even though a lot of people associate this catabo being spoken of here as being the flood of Noah's day, I believe it goes back further because it makes mention of how the second world age will be destroyed by fire. And we
Exactly.
know that this is the one that we are in now.
Oh,
And
I'm
so,
so glad.
Second Peter says, or uh,
Whereby the world that was being overflowed with water perished. Yeah.
absolutely,
Second
and then
Peter
when you look
3:6.
at the Greek for all of those, again, it means completely and utterly destroyed, which
Right.
the flood of Noah did not destroy the world in the manner that we see in Genesis 1:2, where it's having to be recreated and repopulated,
That's right.
not only with hominids, but also with all the creatures that the Lord God makes and then puts into a habitation here upon the earth. And that, yes, with Adam and Eve begins the second world age and the last 6,000 years of world history. And I absolutely do ascribe to this, the 6 days of the modern creation, the 6,000 years, that a day is with God as 1,000 years. And Second Peter speaks about that as well, because this 6,000 year period of the second world age will be destroyed by fire.
That's
At
right. Second Peter 3:7, if you will, I'll read it for you. It says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition. And you're absolutely right. Proper translation would say this earth age. Matter of fact, when Yahusha is talking about the destruction of this age, he specifically uses this word age, speaking of the generation, and that's the toldot. If you go back to Genesis and you understand what that word Genesis actually means, it's toldot. It's the generation or the genealogy of something. So he's talking about the earth age, the age or the generation. So go ahead.
Yes, and so as you made mention in Jeremiah chapter 4,
Verse
verses
22.
23 and on,
Mhm.
and that interestingly is one of the few places where you see the words, without form and void
Mhm.
mentioned in together, which I believe that that connection we're supposed to examine and further in greater context. And you will see that Jeremiah makes mention of a time when the birds of the heaven fled, there was not yet man, and yet you have the cities of the wilderness being destroyed. And so I take that and connect it to what I believe is, even as is revealed in the Kolbrin Bible, of the, in the Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki, the seraphim, dragon-like entities, that they were connected to a prior time. And
Right.
even the Sumerian kings list ascribes to these very long reigns by these demigods.
Mhm.
And, again, the technology and the capacity, the megalithic, cyclopean structures, the temple complexes, the pyramids, built and aligned to the stars in a capacity that we don't have and that we cannot replicate even in this day and age. It all shows to us that there was a previous time,
That's
and
right.
that these structures and this technology was done, in my opinion, by the angels that went to war against the Most High, were cast down and
That's
cast
right.
out and exiled here to the earth.
I
And we
agree.
see, even with some of these cities being built and now found at the bottoms of the oceans, which in my mind shows that they were built at a time when the water levels were completely different. Shows that they had to have been very ancient. And they describe, the melting of the ice age as occurring somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 BC. And so they had to have been developed at least before that time. And so, in my opinion, it shows that they're connected to the fallen angels, the whole premise and the stories of Atlantis and
Right.
all of these different things.
Because the earth itself does not pass away. It's the age. I
Right.
think people need to understand that it's the age. Yahusha specifically talks about the end of the age, not the end of the world or the earth, because the meek inherit the earth.
Right.
And so this is a place where that's why that whole, what is that flying away doctrine? What is that rapture theory? I mean, totally against scripture. We will inherit the earth.
Yeah.
So it's a doing away with this. What does Yahusha call this? The Sanhedrin. He says, you generation, you perverse generation, you've gone astray, you crooked and perverse generation. Excellent. Perhaps we can get into another topic. I mean, we can get into that topic another day. I would love to explore that.
that'd
I
be
have
a
lots
whole
of research on that.
show, easy.
Yeah, with language, especially with the language and interpreting some of the words that,
Right.
again, I believe have purposefully hidden the evidence to these things in the first earth age, us being now in the second earth age,
Yeah.
and then perhaps that third earth age being the millennial rule and reign, and
Eternal age, what Enoch called the
Eternal
eighth
age.
day.
That's it.
Thereafter, there will
Woof.
be no more of the former things because they will all have passed away. Yeah, that's a easy multiple 2-hour show. So if
Yeah.
you want to get into that, I'd be glad to cover that in great detail.
Yeah.
But with regard to the Thracian scriptures, and this is very important in the Thracian Chronicles, it was only in 2006 that a Dr. Stephen Guide and his brother Savetin Gardiski, that they doing the work of examining what are some of the oldest artifacts dating back to 7,000, 6,500 BC, that they were able to decipher the Thracian language, and they found it to be the origin for what became the later Egyptian hieroglyphic system. And they affirm this and prove it, and then they decipher this script and bring the language forward so that people can utilize their interpretation of it to bring forth other manuscripts. And so now there's been a whole collection of what is called the Thracian Chronicles that predate the Sumerian cuneiform text by 1500 to 2000 years. And these particular people, they are said to be the sons of Japhet post flood, and the ones that came up after the flood and are older than the Sumerian mythos, which we know to be pagan. And how right now in the world, all of the historians and all the archaeologists, the anthropologists, they believe that the oldest, the cuneiform texts, are the oldest written language. But the Thracian Chronicles and the Thracian script is found to have been 1500 years older than that. And what is interesting about this is that they were believers and followers of Christ, and they had in their oral traditions and in their chronicles knowledge of Yahushua as the Word, as the Son of God, that he would be the Lamb that would die for the sins of the world. All of this is preserved in their traditions and in their writings, and so they were Christians. And this affirms that whereas everybody believes that Christianity was based upon and plagiarized or counterfeited from the pagan Sumerian traditions, it actually proves the reverse, that the Sumerian traditions and even the virgin birth of Tammuz and Mithras and all of this, that it was based upon the truth of the Christian doctrine that was passed down and preserved through the Thracians and this particular people in this particular line, which is very exciting information. And it's knowledge that people should definitely examine and look at. There's a whole body of material that is coming forth and being translated into English right now. But working with the Thracian Church, I have been privy to receive 3 English translations of what is
Wow.
the most ancient text of the what is called the primary Adamic literature, which are historically cultures and civilizations that preserve the life of Adam and Eve as they transition from being cast out of paradise and living here on the wilderness of the earth, being
Mm,
surrounded by the devils and demons that were already exiled previously. And so the book of Atum and Ua, interestingly enough, preserves again the knowledge of, that the word of the Lord would incarnate into flesh form 5,500 years after Adam and Eve were cast from paradise, and that, all of these different things as far as messianic prophecies. It's absolutely amazing. There's also, I have a 18 chapter English version of the Chronicles of Longinus, which you cannot find in English or any other language, and it tells the story of how Longinus, who was the individual that pierced the side of Christ,
mm,
when he had a war wound where his one eye was blind, and when the blood of Yahushua dribbled into his eye, he was healed. And he then witnessed all of the miracles, the signs in the heavens and the earth, the 3 hours of darkness, the earthquakes, which would swallow up entire synagogues. All these things are mentioned, and he became a believer. And then he wanted to relate with and get to know what were the apostles at that time. And so then it goes into the stories of his interactions with them, and also how he met Lazarus, and Lazarus told him the story of his resurrection, which absolutely made him a believer thereafter. And so, incredible text. There's so many other accounts that, are part of the Thracian Chronicles that we don't have available in English, and they, as I said, they are being translated. But another one is called the Book of Navi, and in this particular story, it speaks about one of the Thracian priest kings. His name is Orpheus, which we know him to be spoken about in Greek mythology, but that he was led by the Holy Spirit and by Christ as the Word, the Logos, to the rediscovery of their ancient, what were jars, much like when the Qumran texts were found. He was led to this very ancient site and led by the Holy Spirit to dig in this one particular place. And when he did, he found these clay jars full of the ancient traditions, his culture's ancient writings and ancient accounts. And he was given knowledge and insight to translate all of this and make them available again to his people, which is, an incredible tale. And it's these accounts and these stories that came to be what are now the Thracian Chronicles. And it shows again that these ancient people were Christians, and they predate the Sumerian, and that our beliefs and our holy books and our faith is not based upon the pagan traditions, but in
very good.
fact, in the opposite is true, that they are counterfeits and plagiarized from the truth of what is Christianity, which is
And I think that's the key here, Dr. Pidgeon. I'll let you touch on that. But before you do, that's the key here. That's the key, is that what Zen is saying is that these particular documents, or this particular book, predates the Sumerian people. And prior to that, the argument was that the Sumerian people are the ones who invented language and then taught it to the children of Yasharel, or the Hebrew people. And so this ancient civilization was the civilization that's superior to the Abrahamic people. So Dr. Pidgeon, you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, if you can, let me pull up the screen here for just 1 second.
Sure.
I'm going to see if I can actually pull it off here. Okay. And because we know that,
And let me know if I got to pull up a link for you if you need me to.
okay, here we go. Okay. Just a second. let me see if I can do this.
And while you're doing that, I'll just give you a brief overview of the Sumerian people. So Sumer is the earliest known civilization in the history. And again, this is prior to the discovery that Zen has concluded upon, but Sumer is the earliest known civilization in the historical region of southern Mesopotamia during the early Bronze Ages, and one of the first civilizations in the world. Okay, so this is the argument, right? Along with ancient Egypt, North Chico, and Indus Valley. What's interesting is last night I was talking to a friend. He says, well, I'm writing a book that also disputes these things. He says, and what I've discovered, Jessica, is that history has been determined to wipe out Abraham's seed from the historical books, like from record, so that there's no record. And if whatever record remains has been skewed so badly that we can't even trace back.
Oh, sure. Those who write history are the ones who define the future, right?
Right.
And and I could tell, I wanted to pull up the PowerPoint. I'm not able to do it.
Oh, okay. You want to email it to me? What do you have? Why can't you pull it up?
It's the same PowerPoint that we were using, but it's in the
I'll do it.
slide.
I got it.
Second slide, right? Slide number 2. I want to show you something about this, because when we talk about, when you read the King James, you're gonna see these children of Japheth, okay? And what we found is that let's go to slide 2 if we can.
Sure. Let me get back to the beginning.
If there we go. One more, one forward. There we go. Now, what we find is that when you just translate, you lose stuff in translation as compared to when you bring it out in transliteration. Now, let me give you an example. When you read this passage in the King James, it's going to say the son of Japheth, right, who was Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tyrus, right? That's what you'll read in the King James, that it was Tyrus. But we went through and said, well, look, let's take a look at these names and see what they actually read. And of course, one of them is, of course, Gimer, right? Now, here we go. Okay, so let's see. Let's take a look. See, okay, so this is, you're looking at the Sefer version, right?
Right. You want to do King James? Sure.
Yeah, you pop up King James and you'll see what I'm talking about, the differences here. So here we go. The sons are Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras, right? Tiras. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's go to the Sefer version and you'll see what the difference is here. And you'll see why so the sons of Yafet, right? Gimer, and Magog, and Madai, and Yavan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and who? Thrace. Okay, not Tiras, but Thrace. Now, why is it? Because, of course, the word begins with a tav, which can be pronounced ta or tha, right? Mm-hmm. And so Thrace, you see it beginning with the tav up there. See, tav, Yod, Resh, Samek, Thrace, right? Mm-hmm. But they say, well, Tyrus. Well, not Tyrus, Thrace. Now, why is it Thrace? Because now we know that these people who call themselves Thracians, Thrace, are actually the sons of Yafet, right? Now, Gomer, on the other hand, is also, can you pull up the Hebrew on Gomer to H 1586?
Do you want 1 Chronicles 15? 1 Chronicles 5 is also giving a genealogy of the sons of Japheth.
Yeah, but not yet. No, this is fine. But let's see. Can you pull up Gomer on the in the strong?
Sure.
1586. Okay, here we now look. Now here, so you see Gomer. Now you have Gimel, Mem, Resh, right?
Right.
But someone said, well, Gimel, Mem, Resh, that must mean, the Masoretes said, let's put a dot there and let's call that a go, right? Gomer. Mm-hmm. But it's not. It's Gemer. It's Gemer. Now, what does Gemer mean? Do you remember? The Abraham's concubine?
Yes, Gomer. Yes.
Well, she said, well, it was Hagar.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Hagar. It's like Sammy Hagar, right?
Right.
Hagar. Well, Hagar. Well, it's not. It's not Hagar. Her name was Hagar, which is not a name at all. It means the stranger. The stranger. Okay. Now, this name here is not Gomer. It's actually Gemer. And with it being Gemer and Thrace, now we can begin to see the tribes, because the Gemer would become the Kemer would become the Kemerians, okay, the Kemerian tribe. And so what we see with the Kemerians is that the Kemerians, now Gomer, of course, is the father of who? Ashkenaz. Gomer is the father of Ashkenaz. But Thrace, these tribes, these sons of Japheth, according to the book of Jubilees, they went north. And so they became pretty much the Greek people. Now, look, when you talk about Thrace, there's an area, a geographical area that has been called historically Thrace for a billion years. Well, not a billion years, but for a long time, it's called Thrace. That area Thrace, of course, is where? It's what we now call modern day Bulgaria. But I can tell you, when you look at this, and I mentioned this to you before the show, Jessica, that I was in southern Russia, right? And I was in this particular province called Kabardino-Balkaria. And in Kabardino-Balkaria, there's two groups of people there, Kabards and Balkars. But the Balkars and the Bulgars are the same tribe, right? You can hear it. Bulgars, Balkars, same tribe. You hear it?
I can.
One's on one side of the Black Sea, the other one's on the other side of the Black Sea. But here we were going to pray. And, Pavel Pogodin, he says, let's pray here. He says, now, Steve, you can pray in English, and then you can pray in Kabard, you can pray in Balkar, you can pray in Azeri, and you can pray in Russian. So there were 6 of us praying, or 5 of us, however many it was. Anyway, so I asked Pavel, I said, Pavel, how can you tell the difference between Kabard and Balkar? And he says, well, Balkar sounds a lot like Kabard, except with a bunch of French fries, right? So it comes time for this guy to pray, and he breaks out into the Bulgar language, and it's like, I'm thinking, okay, that's not possible to really understand that language at all, period. By the time we got to the guy speaking Russian, I was in seventh heaven. Hey, that's a language I can recognize, But so when you're talking about this ancient language, and of course, these guys are assigning to it a Cyrillic format, but when you look at the ancient hieroglyphs, and I've seen some of the photos of the hieroglyphs, it's an Egyptian style hieroglyph. Okay, so here you have a very interesting record that's starting to emerge. Why? Because knowledge is increasing. And this record that's starting to emerge is bringing in some things that are very, very interesting. I'll give you an example. You have the idea that here you have the Sumerian cuneiform, and this is what Zen was talking about. You got Zechariah Sitchin who says, oh, this is the oldest language on earth. This is the oldest record. The Sumerian cuneiform tells us the true story. But that's not true, because the historians will tell you, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian tale, this is the oldest book on earth, and they get out there and they right. The oldest book on earth. But we know from the face of it that the book of Hanok is older, because Hanok is antediluvian. It was written before the flood. Yeah. Mm-hmm. At least in part, was written before the flood, right? So we know that Hanok on its face is older than the book of Gilgamesh. And in fact, the Scroll of the Giants, which was also found in Qumran, is also older than Gilgamesh. Right. Okay? And so to try to claim that the Sumerian record is like the ultimate, cat's meow, it's not. It's not. And most of the Sumerian record that they have now, which is apparently readily translatable now, that record is primarily numbers. It's numbers. It's not words. It's primarily numbers of the 20,000 cuneiform tablets. Yeah. It's like an abacus. It's like some kind of somebody's bookkeeping records.
Exactly.
But what we see with the Egyptian hieroglyphics is these hieroglyphics that they're saying are Thracian hieroglyphics that may even have predated the Egyptian empire. Why? All right, let's get to some of the record. So you have this idea of the house of Yasharel. And the house of Yasharel, there were 12 sons. One of those sons was Judah. Judah had an illicit encounter with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. She got pregnant with twins, and the twins were Zerach and Pharez, or Perez. Now, the Pharisees named themselves after Pharez. Oh, we're of the house of Pharez. That's why we're Pharisees, right? The Sadducees named themselves after Zadok, right? The Zadokim, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. But what happened to Zerach? Zerach didn't hang around. Zerach moved on. And when Zerach got to Egypt, his sons did some significant things. One of his sons went up and formed the city of Athens. That was Calcol. Calcol went and formed the city of Athens. In the mythology, he's called Colchis, but he was known in the Hebrew as Calcol, formed the city of Athens. Darda formed the city of Troy. Ethan formed the city of Cadiz, Spain, right? Zimri hung around. Zimri was the one that hung around, and it was his grandson is the one that that Joshua killed for taking the idols out of Jericho. All right, but anyway, when you look at that record, now it was one of those sons of Zerach, Galathus, the son of Calcol, the son of Zerach, the son of Judah, who came back to Egypt. He came back to Egypt. Now, you get a very interesting record when you look at the Kolbrin record, and you also see this record in other cultures talking about this king known as Ai. Ai. Ai, who was the king? I know who he was. He was Ai. Well, Ai was this king, and he actually occupied the mountains of Edom. But this king Ai was actually, I believe it was Galathus. And Galathus at one time challenged the Pharaoh for the throne. But what we do know is this: Galathus would eventually leave, and he would go through Spain, and he would go to the ports of Lusitania, which was on the western coast of Spain, and they would name that port after Galathus. It would become Portugal, the port of Galathus, Portugal. His people would become the Gaelic people. They would eventually end up in Ireland and Scotland, and also into the Welsh territories. Right, the Gaelic people. Now, what do we find now? That the Qumran is capable of reading these hieroglyphics. So I'm going to be willing to bet you, Zen, that those Thracian hieroglyphics can be read against the Welsh language and probably readily interpreted.
Zen, you have a comment?
That surprised me at all. And yeah, I think, again, it's showing the roots. And also, as you said, the book of Enoch being antediluvian, because in some of the testimonies and some of the extra biblical texts, it speaks about, just as the book of Navi, that Orpheus was led to these ancient records in the similar manner, that these testaments and testimonies were saved and preserved on the ark. And there's a recent book that came out called The Revelation of the Magi, where there's a prophecy in the first book of Adam and Eve that Christ speaks to Adam and Eve, and he tells them that because before Adam leaves paradise, he prays to him that he could take some things from there. And so he allows him to take gold for light so that he can see at night, because he had never experienced darkness before, and also frankincense and myrrh. And he tells him that there's going to be a prophecy associated to that. He says that when he comes and is incarnated into form and takes on the mortal form and is born of his particular bloodline, his particular seed line, that his children, the Seth, that because they were given this prophecy, they had set up what is the order of the Magi, and they were watching for his incarnation, and they set this order up to watch and be vigilant for his coming. And when Christ came into the flesh, the Star of Bethlehem led them to what was the Cave of Treasures, where all of these ancient records from the Ark were preserved. And they were given, and they acquired them and then took them back to their homeland and, reinterpreted them and made them available to us. And I believe that, these are a lot of the deathbed testimonies that came to be, like the Testament of Job, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Testament of Isaac, so many, the Testament of Adam, all these, on and on and on. But that when they went to the Cave of Treasures, they there gathered the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh, and then were led to the cave where Yahushua being born, they offered these gifts in a fulfillment of prophecy to him. And, this knowledge is also coming to light because the Revelation of the Magi is a 2nd century Syriac text that was just translated by Brent Landau and made available to the world. And it's an incredible, it shows that, this prophecy given to Adam, he told him to his son Seth. They passed it down in tradition through their particular lineages, all the way through to the Magi that born and alive during the time when Christ came into the flesh. They were led to the Cave of Treasures in a fulfillment of that prophecy, but that they also inherited much of these ancient antediluvian texts that were preserved for their bloodlines. And as you know, even Enoch said that he knew he was writing for a remote and distant age. And I do believe that God, Yahuwah, has preserved in that manner in other aspects so many, just now even the Thracian Chronicles coming to light, that all of these collections are affirming the truth of Christ, the Logos, the Son of God, the hidden Memra, as Savior Messiah, and that this was known from Adam onwards.
From the beginning. Yeah,
From
it
the
was known
beginning.
from the beginning. Right. Yeah. There's
Fantastic.
actually some texts that are emerging too, also out of places like in Ireland and in the Northern Kingdom there,
Yes.
that also reflect these kinds of prophetic words that were
Right.
in existence even 1,500 years before the coming of the Messiah.
Right.
And I think, and so as we see these collections start to come together now, so we're seeing this incredible kind of unification of the text. And this is one of the things we found when we put the Sefer together, that, there were a lot of people that were asking the question, well, aren't you worried that you're going to burn because you added an extra book to this collection? I had several guys ask me that at the church.
Right.
And I said, no, I'm not worried about burning, because, the Torah is the Torah, Revelation is Revelation, and the collection that we call the Sefer, is a collection of scripture that we think is extremely important. But what we found was none of these were contradictory books at all.
Right.
They're edifying books. They edified one another. They strengthened the faith. They didn't depart from the faith. And even though you have to, there's times when you have to have discernment. Like if you read the Gospels, you'll see that one gospel says there was 2 demoniacs that were occupied with demons. Another gospel says there was one. You have the discussion in the gospel says Judas hung himself, and then you get to the book of Acts and his guts fell out in Potter's Field.
Right.
I mean, you get a lot of discussion like that. If you look at First and Second Kings, the end of First Kings says that Shaul had this guy kill him. And then you get to Second Kings, and the guy said, yeah, I was the one that killed him, or Shaul fell on his sword. Anyway, you get 2 contradictory swords. One says he killed himself. The other one says somebody else killed him for him. And so there's lots of stuff where you have discrepancies of facts. And, and so these discrepancies of facts, and we look at it, we say, well, these discrepancies are, untenable and unreasonable. Until you read something like the Kolbrin, or you read something like the Thracian Chronicles, or some of these other texts that are actually ancient in name, and you find out that these names aren't the same at all. I mean, you're trying to figure out, wait a minute, who was this Egyptian guy? Like, for instance, if you read in the book of Genesis, it will tell you that Joseph was given this Egyptian name, right? Was that the only Egyptian name he was given?
Yeah.
What about Potiphar? Did he have an additional different Egyptian name? Was there more than one name for the Pharaoh? I mean, all of these things, and so when you sit back and you say, well, that fact contradicts and this fact contradicts, you have to be a historian about when you're reading these books and recognize that these scripts are ancient. You can't, if you got a newspaper that told you something that happened in 1912 and you read the same story in 1972, I'll guarantee you they get stuff wrong.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that what we're saying here is that these manuscripts, these findings are in support of, not in lieu of, and nor do they do away with scripture. We're not saying that any of this is superior to what has already been established, but it supports. And even more importantly, I think you used a key word there, unification. So not only are you unifying these concepts and theories, but the people in different regions and different cultures and different countries are actually being drawn into, and they're finding that their identity is not necessarily what they had thought it was, based on what the traditional history books have told them, right? That they were these outcast pagan sorcerers, but in fact, perhaps they were a lost generation that had again been dispersed and now are being rediscovered. And guess what? Heirs of righteousness. Hey, we're going to go ahead and open up this forum quickly for some questions and comments. And again, we have Zen Garcia joining us tonight, special edition of Crossing Over with Dr. Pidgeon. Zen Garcia, how you doing on time? You okay?
Yeah, I am. Can I share one last thing before about the Kolbrin
Of course, you
Bible?
just a second. Let me just let them know so that I can
Sure.
start pulling the questions. Okay, so
Yeah.
you guys, if you have any comments and questions specifically for Zen or for Dr. Pidgeon in regards to any of the topics that we've discussed tonight, those are the only comments that I will be pulling. Please use the all caps feature, and our moderators will let me know if I missed any. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, just wanted to share something from Glenn Kimball, who had received a copy of the Kolbrin Bible and was to make it available. There were 6 sources in 2006, I believe it was, that received and made this translation available. But he says the history of the Kolbrin, that the very word Brit isn't English, but rather Hebrew for covenant. The British considered themselves the people of the covenant because their connection with the 10 lost tribes from the Assyrian conquest of Judea in the 8th century BC. The word Saxon means the sons of Jacob. The 10 lost tribes were never really lost at all. The Kolbrin can rightfully be called the lost Bible of the 10 lost tribes. Jeremiah the prophet fled the conquest of the Babylonians in 600 BC and fled via Ethiopia to Britain, where his tomb is in Ireland to this day. He took with him the daughter of King Zedekiah of the house of David and the illustrious ancestor of Jesus. That is why Jesus' grandmother, Saint Anna, was born in Brittany. That is why the survivors of the crucifixion eventually migrated to France and Glastonbury, England after Jesus' death. They had family and allies in Western Europe. These people knew and understood the teachings of the Kolbrin long before the Bible was compiled in 325 AD by Constantine at the Nicene Council. The Kolbrin also has a special third party account of the Exodus from Egypt at the time of Moshe. Princess Skota, daughter of Ramses II, lived during the time of Moshe and was rumored to have been one of the many princesses who cared for the infant Moshe. She married a Hebrew noble who took her to Britain. Scotland is named after her. The Kolbrin Bible is the collection of documents, the bronze book that was hidden at the time of the burning of the Glastonbury Abbey in England um, by Edward I Longshanks in 1184 AD. It has been preserved by secretive groups for the last 850 years. Edward sought to destroy the Kolbrin, believing it to be a heretical rival of the Holy Bible and a potential threat to his rightful claim as the King of England. By Edward's time in history, the 1,920 acres of Glastonbury had long been considered a sacred gift to the family of Jesus and often operated like a sovereign nation, not paying taxes to the crown and riddled with mystery and religious significance. In 1992, a leader of the failing Hope Trust that considered itself the protector of the Kolbrin distributed a copy before its complete deregistration in 1995, intending to preserve it before it could be lost with the dissolution of the trust. And so that's how the Kolbrin became available to the public and to modern scrutiny.
Yeah, outstanding, Zen. And let me just say a couple of things about that. When it talks about Anna, the grandmother, I had somebody ask me this question earlier today about Anna, the grandmother of the Messiah. Yeah, now Anna was the grandmother of the Messiah because Anna was married to Eli or Heli, as the name is found in Luke 3. She was married to Eli, and Anna was actually let me try to get this right. Anna was actually the sister-in-law of Joseph of Arimathea. And Anna and Eli gave birth to 3 kids. One was Joseph, the husband of Mary. One was Salome, who married Zebedee, whose 2 sons, Jacob and James, would become disciples. And one was Anna, the youngest, who married Bran the Blessed, who was the king in Wales. And her name became Agnes. Yeah, and so and when you get into it, you can get even farther into it if you start studying Aristobulus. Aristobulus, who was the grandson of Herod the Great, Aristobulus had a son named Aristobulus. He also had a son named Matthias, who went by the last name Barnabi, the son of the prophet Barnabas. Matthias Barnabas was the son of Aristobulus IV, and then Aristobulus V would end up becoming the first bishop of Britain. he became the first bishop of Britain, but his brother became Agrippa the First. And so you have this connection between these families. And by the way, Aristobulus IV, who was married to a woman named Berenice, their daughter was a woman named Prudentia. And she was the woman who married Peter, the disciple Peter.
Oh, wow.
And so, you see this contact, the connecting between them. And of course, we haven't got to Simon Zelotes, but when you put these connections between these families, this was a group of cousins and uncles,
Right.
second cousins, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And so this idea of Joseph of Arimathea being in Glastonbury, and Eli, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, he also ended up in Wales in Glamorgan. I believe he was the fellow they call Saint Ilid. And the connection becomes very strong between Aristobulus, who would anoint Bran the Blessed, who would marry Anna, the daughter of Anna and Aharon, the chief priest. So I mean, you get into these things and you find out these people were very, very, very tightly connected.
Yes.
But ultimately, no matter how we look at this genealogy and how you all piece it all together, we have the beginning, the first and the last being Mashiach in the very center of history.
Hallelujah. History being restored, because history gives us a perspective of the beginning and the end. The word says that you shall know the end from the beginning. Hello. And we know that that is past. Hallelujah. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Amen.
Amen.
All right, our first question is from Camilla. And Camilla, we thank you for your support, and everybody else out there in our chat rooms. Thank you to the moderators. You guys do an amazing job. Thank you, Bryant, and everyone else. I'm sorry, Nikki and everyone else that's moderating the group. We have a question here for both Dr. Pidgeon and Zen. What language do you believe the renewed covenant was written in? I will chime in real quick and say it was written in Ruach, in spirit and truth, because even the language has been distorted to some degree.
Yeah, no, I'll put in my 2 cents worth here first. Okay, I think that conceptually, the book of Matthew was in Ivrit, in Hebraic.
Yes.
Was it written down at all? I mean, that's another question. But I believe the Matthew text is the original text. Then you have Mark, and the Mark is a shortened edition. I'm not sure what language Mark was in, but Mark was used primarily for the church that was in the Babylonian fortress. Luke was probably written in Greek, but and then you have some of the texts of Paul that, like for instance, 2 Timothy, I'm virtually certain was written in Aramaic. I mean, virtually exclusively in Aramaic, because there's no Greek fragment of it at all of 2 Timothy. And
thus the Peshitta? You think that's why the Peshitta exists?
Yeah, well, the Peshitta, you have to remember that there are lots of people who believe that the Peshitta, which is the Aramaic form of the Brit Hadashah or the New Covenant, that the Peshitta actually predates the first Greek text. Now, what you see in the record is you have Matthew and you have Revelation and you have the Gospel of John. They have some extant texts from the 2nd century. That's the earliest text we have in Greek. But they claim that the Peshitta was found in its entirety from the 2nd century. And again, I mean, so the Peshitta, and again, I have, I think, like 8 different interpretations of the Peshitta.
I have the Peshitta also. Yeah, go ahead.
And the thing with the Peshitta is that, it's Aramaic's a generous language. And so you get generous interpretations coming from the Peshitta. But nonetheless, again, you're talking about a great reference to be using the Peshitta. But it's hard for us to substantiate what it is we're doing in the Sefer based on the Peshitta.
Okay.
So this is why we don't rely on it that much. But I would say there was, in terms of the writing, there was some language in Aramaic, some in Hebrew, some in Greek. And I believe that the book of Hebrews, which was not written by Paul at all, was probably written in Greek.
Very good, Zen. Zen, what about you? What do you think?
First I want to go back to the oldest language, and like in the Book of Jubilees, I believe that Hebrew was the Edenic language, and it was the language that even the Adam and Eve and the animals spoke in paradise, and it is the language we will be restored to, as it says in Zephaniah. Um, but with regard to the New Testament, it's my opinion that the older are the Hebrew and the Aramaic, and then you have the Syriac and the Greek, and that depending on the region, depending on the people and the population that was being spoken to, and depending on the person that was penning the particular text, epistle, gospel, whatever, that is the reason for the differentiation and the distinction in the different languages and the translations that were made available. But again, in my opinion, even like going back to the Targum, the oldest uh, translation are from the Hebrew into the Aramaic and the Syriac, and then we see later the Greek and on the Latin, and then the English, and all the other tongues and languages of the world. But
Absolutely.
yeah, but it
Something
was
to
not,
look into is Edenics. Have you heard of Edenics by Isaac Mosenson? I mean,
no.
he doesn't support the Paleo Hebrew, but he has done some amazing research that traces all languages back to the language spoken of in Eden, which he claims is Hebrew. And just a really cool
agree with
little
that.
nugget here. The word for ear is ozen, but this word ozen also means balance, a balancing scale, right? It also means a tool, like a matic. And so it's interesting when we understand, again, having a Hebraic mind, the language will help us to interpret these things using wisdom, of course, but the Ruach will also give us a more rich understanding of what it is that we are actually delving into. Again, the ear, same word for ear, is what? Balance. And so I think that there needs to be a balance when we do, because faith cometh by hearing, hearing by the word of Yahuwah. All right, so we have some more questions. And I'm sorry, did you have more to say about that, Zen?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. Lots of questions here. Do you think the apocalypse of Peter is valid and true? Dr. Pidgeon, I'll give you this one, and then we'll hand it over to Zen.
Well, now the apocalypse of Peter is, shall we say, it's got a fire at one end and a torch at the other, right? I mean, the apocalypse of Peter has definitely got some, shall we say, sin and punishment involved in it.
Yes.
The thing is with Apocalypse of Peter, do I believe it's a true book? Yeah, I believe it's a true book. I believe it was a penned book. I don't believe that it's pseudepigraphal or even a faked book. There was a lot of discussion about including the Apocalypse of Peter rather than the Apocalypse of John in in what would be the ultimate canonized text. But the Apocalypse of John or Revelation Kiseon is an extant text from the 2nd century, so it has survived, even though many people, including Martin Luther, wanted to kick it to the curb. So the Apocalypse of Peter, I think the Apocalypse of Peter does have validity. Now, did it come out of, or was it actually written by Peter? Or was it written by somebody else? I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there to tell you who wrote what. I know, for instance, when you talk about a pseudepigraphal work, when you look at Romans 16, you'll discover that Paul didn't write Romans at all, but it was written by Tertius, right? And it was probably written when Paul was in Britain. It was probably written to the British House who was in exile, Caradoc, when Caradoc was in exile in Rome, in that little British exile area. But that's who he was writing to, because he gives salutations to Aristobulus and Linus and some other people who were directly out of the British House that were in Rome at the time. So when you're talking about the Apocalypse of Peter, was it a later work like a Clementine work or something from the 2nd or 3rd century, or maybe even from later work of Augustine or somebody? I don't think so. Now, you have a question when you're asking about this book. You have a question about, like, for instance, the Acts of Peter. Now, the Acts of Peter, I think, is a constructed Roman book. It's a Roman book. But I don't think that's the case with the Apocalypse of Peter. I think there was that is very much a strident and strong view of the original faith. It's certainly laid out in. It's not a gentle book. I'll put it that way.
Right.
All right. What do you think, Zen? And then we have another question right after that. I really want to see if you guys have an answer. Maybe it's found in one of these extra biblical texts. But go ahead, Zen.
I do believe the Apocalypse Peter to be similar to what is found in Mark 13, Luke chapter 21, and Matthew 24, where the apostles ask Yahushua what would be the signs of his return
Mm,
at the end of the age, and that
wow.
it goes into great detail, and as well as the sin and why people are in Sheol, but specifically covers the end of the age, and also answers the question as to what is the parable of the fig tree and what it has connections to, which is interesting because in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, we see that he says specifically, "Know ye the parable of the fig tree." And then he goes on to explain about the tender branches, and when you see it coming forth, to know that summer is nigh. But in the Apocalypse of Peter, Peter asked him to explain what the parable of the fig tree was. They know it not. And then Yahushua associates and ties it to the house of Israel. And
Mm,
so I believe that portion, which is not found in the other gospels, that it connects, that the regathering and what we see as the coming together of Israel as nation again, that was a sign for our generation and an indication as to the end of the age. And I believe that is significant, especially for those of us that are alive now, because it places us right in that time, and of what Enoch describes as, writing for those that would be in tribulation at the end of the age, those that would be living during this distant and remote generation.
excellent, brothers. Thank you so much for that. Next one. And, there's not a lot of information, biblically speaking. There's no record of Tamar's lineage, but that's why I'm asking this question. I have not read all of these extracurricular, I'm sorry, I keep saying curricular, but all of these extra biblical texts. So is there any information regarding Tamar's lineage? Zen, what do you think?
Absolutely. And I was just writing about this in my newest book on the Vestures of Light and the Rod of Wonder, because Tamar, it is through her, because of
Right.
her, that the Messiah's
Mashiach comes.
lineage was continued. And the
Right.
reason being is because Judah took a wife of the Canaanites. And that's why we see that Tamar, when she was married off to all of the sons of Judah, they were cursed in death. She was actually a daughter of Shem, and so she was a prophetess, and she was very holy, and she was instructed by the Holy Spirit to go and wait for Judah, because God was going to preserve the bloodline uh, through her. And so, yeah, you can find a great detail on her lineage found in the Cave of Treasures, and it goes specifically into the story of Tamar and why it was that she, all of the children of Judah were struck down in death, and how it was that she kind of had to, the Holy Spirit had to trick Judah into laying with her in order for the bloodline to be preserved through her as a daughter of Shem. Because again, she was a prophetess, and that's why we see that bloodline and the distinction of the bloodlines, and that's why you see great detail given to preserving whom had begotten whom and who had sired who, because again there
Powerful.
is this distinction between the two different bloodlines, and as it plays out all throughout scripture. And you'll also see that in the book of the bee, which is another that has great detail on the generations and the lineage of Yeshua, that you see Cain is not found in Luke chapter 3, verses 30 through 38, or the book of the bee, or the cave of treasures, where the lineage of Christ is preserved in great detail, both through Mary and as well through Joseph. And there's another text called On the Priesthood of Jesus Christ, which goes into great detail as to how he fulfilled both priest and king, because we see
Mm,
that the lineage of was the right, the kingship and the priesthood was split amongst Judah and Levi, but that Mary was actually from both Aaron and the line of King David, and so Yahushua was rightful priest and king, and that the fulfillment of that was found within him. I do recommend that people read on the priesthood of Jesus Christ. It is an amazing text, and we have published it with my son's new book, The Word of the Lord, an analysis, comparative study on the hidden memra, because
Oh,
it affirms exactly what we were talking about, that the Pharisees, the Jews, they knew without a doubt that he was Savior Messiah and hid it.
and hid his progenitor.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in that, they also confirmed that Mary was a virgin, and they also declared that he was a son of God, because
Mm.
what they had is they preserved 22 priests as part of and traced down their lineage. And this tells the story of how Yahushua was the last to be entered into this particular codex, because it was thereafter that the Romans destroyed the temple as a fulfillment of, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 as well. Fascinating text.
Wow.
Recommend that people read. I'll send it to both of you tomorrow. So you can check
Fantastic.
it out.
Oof.
Yeah.
Do we have to end, guys? Never.
Right.
Fantastic. What do you have to say, Dr. Pidgeon, about that? We have another one regarding the supernova or the star of Mashiach. So let's see if we can get to that one right after Tamar's lineage. Dr. Pidgeon?
Yeah, no, I think Zen really sized it up well. He really, when we talked about the show, the last show we did, and I put up the timeline, of how long Shem lived, and how he outlived Abraham and almost outlived Yitzhak,
Sure.
lived well into the life of Yaakov. So you see something that's very, very significant in these bloodlines. And again, these genealogies, they do matter. And that's why I look at the New Testament and I see this, Matthew 1. It's like people reading it. It's like, I remember the first time I read Matthew 1, it's like, who cares about the begat?
It matters. Yeah.
Right. But now it turns out that it's critically important. It's
Yes.
critically important. And that by having this culmination, and you mentioned 22 in the Levitical line of priests, right? That they were counting.
Yes.
And see, that's a very significant number because it comports with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Yes,
It
exactly.
also supports
Wow.
the 22 patriarchs from Adam until Jacob, right? There were 22 patriarchs from Adam to Jacob.
Wow,
And-
that's amazing, Dr. P. I didn't.
Yeah. And when I look at that whole deal and I see that 22 come up, there is something to be said for that, and it has some, Anyway, let's continue. What was Mashiach star? A supernova or something else? Ha yeah. No. I'll tell you there was discussion here this last year, maybe it was in 2017, that the Star of Bethlehem was seen again. The Star of Bethlehem was seen again. Now, I got to tell you, my weakness in all of my studying is the studying of astronomy. I mean, I'll grant you, I'm a weak person on that. I have friends that really get into the constellations and downloading the apps and looking at this, that, and the other thing. It's not my forte. It's not my strength. Yeah.
I'll send you a copy if you want.
Yeah, sure. But but what you're looking at but there was this very significant sign that happened in the heavens on September 23rd, 2017.
Yes.
So one-time sign, and it was I believe it was the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. And what that signifies in terms of timeline, I don't know, but I think it did trigger the Revelation 12 prophecy. And so when we see this, the idea of a supernova or something else, I'm not sure what it was, but I can tell you that the Magi were looking for it, and the Magi knew what it was, and it didn't happen. This is one of the things I want to try to clear up. The Magi didn't show up 2 years after his birth. They showed up within 7 days of the birth. They came at the time of Miriam's uncleanness. That's when they showed up. And they showed up because they immediately fled. They didn't go back to Bethlehem after they went to the temple. They went to Egypt because they were told, get out of here. Herod's going to kill you. Then Herod goes and kills all the children under 2 years old. That's why people think it was, 2 years later. It wasn't 2 years later. And they had plenty of time for the sign. So the sign happened sometime, I think it happened in June or July. And then they came out to see the birth of the child, which didn't happen until September.
Yes.
But they were well aware of what was happening. And so, and this idea of the Magi being astronomers, again, you have what's called the Matzerot, which is discussed in Ezekiel. And you also have this discussion, this is 114 that says, look, you can use the sun, the stars, and the moon for signs and wonders, And, so we know that there's signs given in heaven. So when those signs are given, well, this is what Revelation 12 says. Behold, there was a wonder given in heaven. There was a sign given in heaven, right? And
yeah. Let me show you something really quick. Back in 2014, remember when the blood moons were happening, and we had used an app that was here from Los Angeles, California. We used an app that helped us to check the celestial signs, and this is what we found. I'm talking about the I don't know if you can see. Can you see that, Dr. Pidgeon?
Yeah, you got it up.
Okay, good. No, I mean, but can you see the little lines, the details?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. Okay, so what it says here is, this is no coincidence. This is my post here. The blood moon, look at this, was in the loin of Virgo, and Mars, which the pagans called the planet of war, this was in her heart. And I had determined this to be signs and wonders. But you can see the constellation of Virgo here. And that's what I'm asking, if you can see the details of Virgo here. And you can see where Mars is located. You can see where the moon is located. And it's interesting that it would be in her heart and in her loins. And that, in other words, was this a declaration of war that was going to come against us at that particular time? I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting. And the Mazzaroth, actually, I've studied just a little bit. But Zen, have you studied anything from the Mazzaroth? I know Job makes mention of Orion. He makes mention of many constellations quoted from the Mazzaroth. What do you have to say about that?
Even when you study the different books, like the Assater, the Secret Book of Moses, it makes mention of Adam being given 5 books when he left paradise, and one of them was the Book of the Signs, another one the Books of the Wars of the Lord, and another the Books of the Generations of Man. And we see that in the Book of Enoch, we see connections to these particular books, in my opinion. For instance, the Book of the Signs you can find as the book on the courses of the heavenly luminaries, which talks about and details in great elaboration how the sun and the moon, the wandering stars, and also the luminaries move in circle above the face of the earth. And then you see, with regard to the Book of the Generations of Man, that there's what is cited as the dream visions, where Enoch speaks to his wife Edna and tells him of kind of these animal farm parables of all the generations of humanity from Adam and Eve. Even speaks about the stars that came down and took wives, of all which they chose, and goes into great elaboration on that, and makes mention of uh, the Messiah, that he would be born of Adam's bloodline as well. And so we see that the end is revealed from the beginning, and that Adam, reading from this book, knew what his children were going to do. And he even passed this down. We see in all the testimonies, like when you read the different testimonies of the different patriarchs, it always occurred that when they were on their deathbed, they would have a confession, and they would gather the families together around them for both blessing, and then they would share with them in prophecy what God had revealed to them that would happen to their particular children, so that he would give them warning. And these deathbed confessions were written down as the testaments. We have the testament of Adam, the testament of Seth, on and on, the testament of Enoch, which is the book of Enoch, and on and on and on, the different confessions of the different patriarchs that were alive during that time. And so,
Excellent.
so we see that, the knowledge of the stars, even though, yes, the fallen angels did usurp, and they instilled blood and children's sacrifice, and other perversions and abominations, and like sexual orgies in connection to this particular knowledge, and perverted it. But originally it was given and shared to Adam and to the what is called the Melchizedekian priesthood, which was passed down from Adam to Enoch to Noah to Shem to Abraham, and to then Isaac and Jacob, and on and
Love
on
it.
and one.
Let me read something here regarding that word mazel. And it's interesting because I've also discovered, using this word, actually looking into this word, that perhaps these fallen ones can be likened to stars. That's what's interesting. And I think there's sort of I don't know, there's sort of a dispute there, because if in fact these melachim can be likened to stars, then how is it that we can pull information from the stars? But anyways, we'll get into that in just a second. But let me read this really quick. This is from the word mazel. So I had been researching this word and I discovered that the word maz, and so this is a compound of the word mazel. Maz in Hebrew means air and reflects that which is aloof or ascended. And we know that El means God, and Tov in Hebrew means good. So this word Mazel Tov in Yiddish, where it originated, came from the idea that stars or celestial beings were gods, specifically a constellation of good stars and destiny. That's what it actually means, Mazel Tov. In Job 38:32, the word Maseroth is used to define, that word's actually there in that verse, is used to define the constellations as in the stars of heaven, and is compared to the Hebrew word for a planet. Mazalah, that's the root of this word, Maseroth, Allah meaning ascension or lofty. Thus, the word is rendered as the gods of heaven, specifically the stars or celestial bodies, as lofty beings, the ascended ones versus the fallen ones, quite possibly from another fictitious planet. Now, the Hebrew application of this word phrase, Mazel Tov, suggests that Mazel is not a term that attributes glory to Yahuwah, the Elohim of all creation, but rather to the created beings in high or lofty places. So,
whoops.
I mean, right? Mazel tov, right? Because again, this concept that's coming from a Yiddish interpretation is that celestial beings are benevolent, and when invoked, will cast good fortune upon you. That's what this term actually means. Good fortune from the gods above, right? Thus, the term mazel tov is accepted among the Jewish culture as a blessing. However, the true and most likely unknown purpose of this phrase is actually a recitation invoking the good fortune of the celestial star gods.
Yeah, it shows how they got corrupted,
Right?
involved with them. Which is, we have a warning in Wisdom of Solomon and Deuteronomy as to, doing that, invoking the gods and sacrificing to demons and devils, which they did.
And Yahusha says that he has seen Satan falling even as a star, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. This stuff is very interesting. All right. We have more questions. Are you doing good, Zen? We got about maybe 10 more minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm good.
Okay, good. You guys are just too much. I want to keep you here all night. And so hang on, let me just roll to them. We have so many. And I just want to keep up with the questions and we kind of answered some of these already. Hang on. And we're asking for some sources. If you have any questions regarding the sources that they're citing from, you can go to their websites. I will make those websites known in just a minute. I think I lost them. Hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. Dr. Pidgeon Zen, do you know Dr. Miles Jones, the Catalina Hebrew Gospels? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, the Catalonia Hebrew Gospel.
Oh, Catalonia. Yeah, did I read that?
Yeah, and
what did I say, Catalina?
he did, and I did receive that, Ronnie, and I took a look at those. Now, again, we have some interesting fragments there on the Catalonian Hebrew Bibles, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about the Shem Tov Matthew Gospel. And then there are these fragments that I believe are 7th and 8th century, at least that's what they're purported to be, of Luke, and I think it's of Mark, Luke and Mark. And I mean, I don't recall now exactly because it's been a while since I've read through them. But I mean, I can tell you, when you're talking about the Catalonian record, my personal belief is that those texts are going to have appeared. They're subsequent record. In other words, they're not text, Hebrew text. They were subsequent record that were developed during the time that both Jews and Moors lived in Spain successfully side by side. How early did they predate Maimonides? I don't know if they did that. And again, I haven't had the opportunity to really look into those documents. I did notice, however, that when I looked at those particular texts of, I think it was Luke and I think it was Mark, when I looked at those texts, they were free of Masoretic symbols. And that is a big deal. because of course the Masoretes, most of the Masoretic decoration was put in place around the 8th century, And now, of course, you can't get any text without Nicodim, which is the vowel signs that you see. And the vowel signs are, in my opinion, a corruption. I mean, on one hand, you wouldn't be able to read the Hebrew at all, I suppose, if you didn't have the vowel signs, unless you had some other construct for understanding the Hebrew. And as I study the Hebrew, I believe there is another construct to the Hebrew, that you have some consonants that have a vowel sound connected to them. And you do have vowels. Contrary to the Masoretic opinion, you do have vowels. You have which is aleph. You have which is he. You have e, which is yod. You have o and u, which is vav. And you have the schwa sound, which is the ayin. That's my opinion. And I think when you take that and you marry it to some of the other vowel sounds that were connected with certain of the consonants in the Hebrew language, you get a different story. So Hebrew would be spoke completely different than the way the Masoretes speak it. But the texts that were sent from Dr. Miles Jones, or at least that he put up on his website, those were texts that were free of the Masoretic vowel sounds. So they could imply a predating. They could imply a pre-8th century creation. Okay, so I'll leave it with that, Ronnie. That's as far as I've gotten in that research.
Zen, do you have a comment? And again, please, in the chat room, unfortunately, I'm not able to get to all the questions, and I'm finding that a lot of your questions are being answered as we go through them. Please use the all caps feature so I can distinguish between comments and your questions. Also, please stay on topic. If you have any questions regarding the sources that they are citing from, you can email them directly and ask for those sources. Go ahead.
I'm
Zen.
not familiar with the text, so I can't really comment.
Okay. So what is... All right. So the next question, Zen, what's your comment regarding the wormwood prophecy, Tom Horn, regarding the coming asteroid collision discussed in Revelation?
I believe that wormwood is associated to what the Kolbrin Bible talks about as the destroyer, and that you will find great elaboration on what the destroyer is and how it has played part in different eras of history, including the Exodus. And so I do recommend people take a look at that particular narrative in that book. Or I've done many shows on the destroyer and its connections to wormwood and the end of the age. So you can just search that on YouTube as well.
This is a good one right here, Zen. This is specifically for you. Why wasn't Cain the first giant if his father was an angel? Who says he wasn't?
Yeah, actually, in the text it says that he had a seraphic appearance, and in my opinion, all the first 10 generations of even humanity, that they were of larger stature and lived longer lifespans. They lived up to 1,000 years old. So, in my opinion,
There you go.
and even in the Book of Enoch, it states that the giants, they lived almost immortal lifespans, and that was one of the reasons why Gilgamesh was looking for, because he knew death was coming upon him and that the giants had no portion in salvation. And so he was seeking to extend his longevity. And as we talked about previously, the Gilgamesh is mentioned in the Book of Giants. And so that shows, that the Hebrew and the Book of Enoch and these other antediluvian books are much older than the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so, I do again believe that even the giants, that their stature and lifespan was reduced to 500 years, as it says in the Book of Enoch. But there was something definitely different about Enoch, and I mean not Enoch, but Cain, that he had a seraphic appearance, and we see in the story that the serpent is also said to be that old serpent, that ancient dragon, and that the bloodlines connected to Cain are said to be a brood of vipers, a den of vipers. And so we see on and on this connection to the seraphic appearance that he was initially born with. So he was different. And whether he was a giant, again, I believe all of the first 10 generations of humanity were much older, that even Shem, after post flood, he lived to 600 years. And it wasn't until Abraham died at 175, and by the time of Moshe, then the lifespan of humanity was reduced to 120 years.
My goodness, my goodness. Dr. Pigeon Switch is asking, who do you think wrote Hebrews, and did Timothy write any letters or books to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that, I mean, the KJV interpreters assign Hebrews to Timothy, and it's possible that he's the one that wrote it. Other people have said it was a female writer, could have been Priscilla, and other people. I think it may have been somebody else entirely. I think there's some doctrine in Hebrews that I did a recent discussion on it when I was preparing for our show last week, and I haven't published that blog yet because I haven't finished it, but I'm going to get it finished. But in talking about Melchizedek and so forth, there's an interesting doctrine that appears in the book of Hebrews that appears to be a bit Aryan in Hebrew. And this is a very difficult subject because, of course, the book of Hebrews is the book that is relied upon for most of the Arianism, the Arian doctrine, which is that Mashiach was begotten or created. He didn't exist until he was born by Mary. That's Arianism. And there is some doctrine inside the book of Hebrews that appears to support that. On one hand, and then it contradicts. It says Melchizedek has no beginning, no descent, no mother, no father, no end. And that's an accurate description. But this whole idea of being begotten is an interesting concept. It appears in Hebrews. Now, when I looked at that concept, I thought, okay, so if we have that concept, this is going to be a post-second century idea. And it's going to be subject to these doctrines of Arian, or Arius was his name. Now, if that's the case, then we have somebody entirely different as an author. And remember, you have to keep in mind that the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, did not formulate. People think, the Brit Hadashah was concluded, in 70 AD, end of story. No, it wasn't. It wasn't at all. If you go back and you look at the extant texts, you have 3 texts from the 2nd century. You don't get the culmination, really, of most of the book until the 3rd century. And there is no copy in the Greek of 2 Timothy. So, you have the book starts to, arrive at a collection of 27 books around 430 AD is when you finally start solidifying into 27 books. So was it possible that the book of Hebrews was written in the 2nd century by somebody totally distinct? It's very possible. And if you go back and you look at the Greek, you can do this on your own software. You can take a look at the Greek writing. You'll see that the epistles of Paul are very clunky and chunky. It's like almost a kind of a crude language. And then you get to the book of Hebrews, and it's this most eloquent penmanship. I mean, this is why Hebrews is rarely misinterpreted by other authors, because it's so eloquently written, so beautifully written, and so the semantics are so well done, because it really crosses into modernity, if you will. It crosses into modernity. And so, did I think Timothy wrote it? I don't think Timothy was the one who wrote it. I think it was somebody later than that. I think it was the 2nd century writing.
All right, we've got a question here from Lorita, and she says, do you have any explanation on the RH negative bloodline from Eden, the RH blood groups system being the rhesus, RHE, what is it, RHEU, RHESUS. So RH.
Yeah, that's the Latin.
Protein. It's a protein on the blood cell. And if you have the protein, then you're considered positive. And this attributes itself to the ABO system. So if your blood type is A and you have this protein on your blood cells, then you would be considered A positive. If you don't have this protein on your blood cell, then you're considered negative. So that's how that works. And it was actually named rhesus, or however you pronounce that, rhesus, I think, after the rhesus monkey. But this is a misnomer. And so it's no longer.
I'm going to go very quickly and say, I don't think the bloodline is significant of the DNA. Okay. I think the DNA is something quite distinct.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's all I'm going to say.
Easy peasy. What do you think, Zen?
I am no great expert on these matters. My forte is the study of the scripts, but I do believe that there may be some possible connection to as far as the angelic interdiction into the affairs of humanity, the crossing over, with the sons of God and the daughters of man, and that there is possibly some psychical links to this bloodline, and that's one of the reasons why the elites kind of strategically marry. But again, I'm no expert at it, and I'm with Dr. P in that the bloodlines are no longer significant because Christ died on the cross for all of us and
Amen.
extended salvation to all.
Hallelujah. And just to clarify, the DNA, the genetic information that is housed within the cell, is different than blood typing. And so I think you're onto something, Dr. P. The DNA is probably the most important factor here. The genetic information that's passed down from one generation to the next. Let's see, next question, and then we'll conclude with that for the night. Oh, I think I lost it anyhow. Here we go. Do you gentlemen, this is from Professor Graybeard, do you gentlemen see any connection between the Essenes and Yahusha or Yahukanan the Immerser? Then we'll let you take that one.
I'm no positive on that. I don't really know. Again, my study and my focus is on the ancient manuscripts. As far as the historicity of the different people groups, the Essenes, their connections to Qumran,
Sure.
and if Christ and John the Baptist in some way had connection there, I have no positive or any kind of
Sure.
applications that I can really declare.
All right, Dr. Pidgeon, I'll let you have that one for tonight, and then we will conclude tonight's show. Just a reminder, Wednesday, we will be joining, Dr. Pidgeon and I will join Zen Garcia. It's a Christmas special. I will be presenting on the psychological effects of Christmas and those ties into the psychosomatic aspects of our brain. And Dr. Pidgeon will discuss the historical relevance of Christmas. And Zen, what will you be presenting on regarding that topic?
I'm just going to be moderating and following in both of your leads.
Oh man, I'm excited for this one. It's beginning to look a lot like debt. It's beginning to look a lot like debt. That's what it's beginning to look a lot like. All right, Dr.
Keep all your money going into the tithe until you get to Christmas. Then spend yourself into a debt oblivion that takes you until next Christmas to get out.
Right, exactly.
Forget about it. You want to do something with your money, save it for Sukkot. That's what you should do. Save it for Sukkot. All right, go ahead and finish that question up, Dr. Pidgeon, and we'll conclude for tonight.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say that, when I was at Qumran, there was a discussion, was John the Baptist here? And I think, but a lot of the archaeology was faked because they were digging out pits at every one of the houses to try to pretend like everybody had a bathtub, And I don't think that was the case. I think the Dead Sea was much, much larger much larger. It was a vast, almost an ocean. It was a very large lake. And I believe that was Galil, and I think that's where Mashiach did come from. I think that's where Nazareth actually was. And so much of that happened there, not at Kinneret. But nonetheless, you have the question of who are the Essenes, who are the people at Qumran, who were, was there a true Levite priesthood there? Who were the people that built Qumran? Qumran is one of the great mysteries, and I think it's one of the great revealing things that's actually in the Holy Land right now. So one day, Jessica, we're going to do a show on the Copper Scroll. When we do a show on the Copper Scroll, we're going to be able to reveal so much about Qumran and what it means. And of course, Qumran is what the Arabic world used to call Damascus. And if you look right now, you'll see that Qumran is a ruinous heap of stones, and there's nothing else there but a ruinous heap. But if it was Damascus, you could see very easily how Paul could have walked down there from Jerusalem, and also how the Essene, the community, would have moved down to Qumran for some period. But one last thing I'm going to put to that is that when you're talking about Qumran, you're talking about a community that ultimately was a city of refuge from those people who called themselves Qumri, that is, the children of the kingdom of Omri, the king who amended the law in the northern kingdom, and who would call themselves Qumri. And those same Qumri are the ones that ended up being chased out of the Holy Land right around 722 BC to populate the tin mines of Britain. So we have some very interesting connections there. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes together in terms of the Essenes, in terms of the Druze, in terms of those who call themselves Nazarenes, etc. There's a lot of stuff to know that is still unfolding in terms of what's happening in the Holy Land today.
Oh, excellent. Gosh, it just gets better and better. Listen, reminder, Zen Garcia's Sacred Word Publishing. Go there, support them. His son, Justin has a new book that he has just recently published, must read, and then we can have further discussions regarding that particular topic. What's the name of the book, Zen?
The Word of the Lord, a
That's right.
comparative analysis of the hidden memra.
The Memra. All right. And then you have a conference coming up. It is the Sacred Word Revealed Conference, which I hope to be at. And this will happen March 27th through the 29th. And that is going to take place in
Atlanta, Georgia. And
yeah.
yes, and go to sacredwordrevealed.com for further information. Dr. P, myself, my son, Rob Skiba, Gary Wayne, Yana and Stephen Ben-Noon, Nathan Reynolds, Laurel Austin, and I do believe, and Dr. Joy Jeffries Pugh will all be speaking there.
Powerful. And shout out to my personal friends, Isaac and Tony Chavez, whom I will be staying with. So shout out to them. Go check out their stuff, Head Honcho products. And let's see, what else do we got? Remember, Wednesday, what time is your show, Zan? When
8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern. You can go to freedomslips.com. We will be on Studio B live 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern.
Okay, Freedom Slips Radio.
Freedomslips.com.
Is that Revelation Radio?
Revelation Radio.
Revelation Radio.
Yep.
Okay, so I will send out a link, and tomorrow I will post on the newsletter. Dr. Pidgeon, you guys have a newsletter that goes out as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's Rex Harris kicking out the newsletter. Come on, stop by us at sefer.net and drop us a line. And, don't forget to get yourself a copy of the Sefer.
Yeah, mention my code there. And I will post all that information here. Make sure that you hit subscribe and like so this can generate excellent discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much, Zen, for joining us. This is not the last time we will have you here on Crossing Over. So much more to discuss. I look forward to that first Earth Age conversation and wish you best blessings, and I hope you feel better. Anything else you guys would like to close with?
No, other than send me your email address, because I'm going to send you both that particular scripture I was talking about on the priesthood of Jesus Christ. So yeah, I need your email address, and Dr. P, I'm already have it ready to go out to you. So
excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zen. I am going to pick up Justin's book. That's a critical book for anybody who's interested to read it. It's a very important book.
Sure. And after you finish reading it, we'll have Justin on to discuss it. All right, everybody, we want to wish you well, and thank you for joining us tonight, Sunday edition, special edition with our guest, Zen Garcia. We thank you for your time and consideration. Gentlemen, blessings to you. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Good night, all. Shalom.
Good night.